This is the Laird's Winter Rose, written by Barrel Coops.
During a blizzard, Lady Elizabeth MacRae and gardener's apprentice Rory Kincaid spend one breath-held night saving winter roses and awaken something tender and dangerous. With whispers rising and duty closing in, stolen glances turn into quiet vows beneath glass and snow. A closed door, heart-aching Scottish romance about warmth taking root where the world says it shouldn't. The Laird's Winter Rose. Chapter 1. The glasshouse in the storm. Snow came like a curtain, a clean white wall that swallowed hedges, lanes, and the long face of MacRae House, until even its chimneys were only smudges against the dark. The servants barred shutters and banked fires. In the study, a lamp burned late over the estate ledgers. But Elizabeth was not in the study. She was running, head down, along the gravel path that had turned to bone-hard glass beneath the drift. The wind pressed needles into her cheeks and tugged her cloak back like an impatient hand. She kept one arm tight around the bundle she'd carried from the linen room, old sacking, a wool blanket, and the shawl that used to sit about her mother's shoulders. The glasshouse rose out of the white like a whale's rib cage, iron-curved and rimed with frost. One span of roof had snapped the week before, and the temporary boards thudded and squealed now as the gale tried to pry them free. Elizabeth pushed at the door. It stuck, then gave, and warm, damp air rolled out, earthy and green and edged with lemon, the scent of the geraniums the gardeners kept by the door for visitors to stroke. She slipped inside and pulled the bolt across. The storm's scream dulled to a throatier moan in the iron frame. Her breath showed in small clouds. Panes were more ice than glass. Beneath them, the beds waited, furrowed and tidy, each clamped with cloches like little sleeping bells. "Still safe," she whispered, though her heart already tumbled. At the back, under the last of the intact panes, stood her mother's roses. Not fancy, not the showy tea roses that came up from England in crates, but the sturdy shrub she'd loved, deep winter-bitten leaves, thorny as temper, scent like honeyed tea when the petals opened. Elizabeth set the bundle down and pulled off the clumsy muff she'd worn over her gloves, sacking first, tucked along the seams where the boards quivered, the blanket next over the corner that wept cold. She worked fast, fingers turning dull and wooden in the chill. A crack sounded like a pistol shot. Elizabeth flinched and spun. A diagonal white line had chased itself across a pane above the walkway. It held, just, but a pinch of frost glittered along the split. "Don't move," a voice said, low and close to the door. She turned. A man stood in the entry with a hand lantern, the light cupped against the wind that had sneaked in with him through the smallest gap. He was broad-shouldered beneath a rough wool coat, cap pushed back, snow crystals clinging to a day's stubble. Not a stranger, the head gardener's apprentice, Rory Kincaid. "My lady." He dipped his head a fraction, eyes already above her shoulder, taking stock. "I thought I'd find you here." "How?" It made her sound foolish, as if she were a child caught with jam on her sleeve. "You weren't at the house," he said simply, and set the lantern on a bench. "And the storm's turning." He crossed to the split pane, lifted one gloved hand, and listened to the glass sing. "It'll go if the pressure drops again." "I've sacking." She hated how defensive it sounded. "And the cloches are firm. I checked the vents." "You did." Approval was gentle as he said it. "But we'll want more weight at the base. Compost heat if we can rouse it, and the frame skewed to break the wind. Mr. Pritchard went home hours ago. He's not to see that finger of his turn black with cold again." "Father will be angry if he knows I'm here," Elizabeth said, because the truth had to be set in the room between them. Rory's mouth tipped, not quite a smile. "Then we'll give him nothing to be angry about and a glasshouse full of living plants in the morning." Another crack. The diagonal line blossomed into a star. Rory moved without raised voice or wasted motion. He lifted a wooden prop from the wall and wedged it against the frame, then shrugged out of his coat and handed it to her. "Put that on under your cloak." "I'm not," she nearly said, fragile. He had already turned away, hauling a bin of fresh compost to the far bed. Heat rose from it in a faint breath as he pitched forkfuls into the trench along the outer walkway. He worked clean, quick, the way men do who've learned to save their words for when they matter. Elizabeth took his coat because she could feel her fingers again when she did. She dragged sacking to the back beds and tucked the worst of the draughts with slow, stiff care. When the cracked pane finally let go, it sounded like a brittle sigh. The glass dropped, hit the frame, and burst into a scatter of bright knives. Rory's hand closed around her arm and drew her against him. An instinctive shield. A sliver nicked his knuckle. Blood showed sudden and bright. He released her the instant the shards settled, but the air between them felt shifted, as if some small truth had been spoken aloud. "You're bleeding," she said. "It'll keep." He wrapped his handkerchief around the cut and tied it with his teeth. "We'll pin a board there. Hold this." He passed her a square of timber, and she braced it as he drove a nail with the heel of his palm. The sound was drowned by wind. "Rory," she said, and tried his name on her tongue. He didn't startle. He only looked at her properly, the way one looks at a bird too quick to stay. "My lady." "Will it be enough?" "It will be what we can do." He tipped his chin toward the back beds, "And we can do more there." They went together, shoulders almost touching, steam lifting from the compost like ghost breath. He showed her how to angle the cloches to catch what warmth there was, how to lay the shawl over the rose she most feared to lose, and leave a gap to let it breathe. She had grown up in this place, and yet no one had ever put tools in her hands as if they belonged there. "Mr. Boyd says the accounts are difficult," she said finally, because the storm made people honest and the night felt long. "I hear what the men grumble," Rory answered, steady, "but I know what grows when you give it heat and light." "Money?" "Food," he said, and then, with the faintest sideways glance, "and hope." They worked until the ache in her shoulders had a rhythm, until her breath came easier and the roses were tucked as if the glasshouse itself had drawn a blanket over them. Now and then Rory told her to stand by the lantern and rub her hands. Now and then she told him to let her lift the heavier pot. Neither of them obeyed very well. Past midnight the storm eased to a tired hiss. Snow packed itself along the foundations and up against the door like a faithful dog. The glass no longer sang. In the small hush, Elizabeth felt the beat of her own heart slow to match the soft ticking of Thor within the compost. Rory straightened, hands on his hips, hair damp at the brow. "We should keep watch till dawn. The wind'll try once more at the turn." "You can go," she said, though the thought of it tightened something in her chest. "I can stay." "Alone?" He shook his head. "The roof's a temper when it wants to be. I'll take the bench. You can have the stool." He looked at the shawl she'd used on the back bed. "Is that—" "My mother's." The words came like the first breath after a held note. "She loved this place best. I thought, if something of hers kept them warm—" "It will," he said quietly. "Things remember kindness." They sat in the glow of the lantern, with the soft rise of warmth at their boots, and the cold pressed hard to the other side of the glass. Elizabeth rested her forearms on her knees and watched the outline of thorns and leaves become a kind of lacework in the dim. "Thank you," she said into the hush. Rory's answer came after a moment. "You came first," he said. "I only followed." Outside, the wind turned and tested the house one last time. Inside, two people listened together, and the roses slept. Chapter 2. Thorns and Threadbare Ledgers. Dawn came pale and bruised, the kind of light that does not warm so much as admit the day must be born. The glasshouse roof showed its wounds in quiet lines, boards nailed over sudden sky, a scatter of chipped edges swept into a neat pile by the door. The storm had gone, leaving silence tucked into every seam. Elizabeth woke with a start, the stool hard against her spine. Rory rose from the bench at the same time, as if they had shared the same thought. His hand went first to the roses, lifting the shawl's corner to check the breath of air left under it. He nodded once, satisfied. "They'll answer the sun," he said, "if the pipes wake." "The pipes?" She looked along the wall and saw the iron run that should have held warmth. Frost laced it like lace on a gown. "Can you coax them?" "I can try." He flexed the hand he'd cut. The handkerchief was dark at the knot. "You should let Mrs. Drummond see to that," Elizabeth said. "If you won't, I will." He made a small sound, consent or refusal, she could not tell. "Go up to the house, my lady. You'll be missed." Reluctance felt childish on her tongue. "Thank you," she said instead, and folded the shawl with a care that made her throat ache. For the night," he finished, sparing her. His mouth did that not smile again. We'll make it hold." She left him with the lantern and the broken mourning, and walked the path back through drifts that reached her knees. At the service door, Mrs. Drummond met her with a towel warmed at the hearth and eyes that held no surprise at all. "Shoes off," the housekeeper said softly, "and your cloak. We'll see to the hem. Breakfast tray to your room, my lady." "Father will want me in the study," Elizabeth said. She hardly knew how she knew it, only that the pull of it was as clear as the scent of frying bacon from the kitchen. Mrs. Drummond's glance fell to Elizabeth's hands. "You've been useful," she said, which was praise from her. "I'll send Nellie with tea. Go on." The study smelled of lamp oil and old leather. Laird Alastair stood by the window with a ledger open and a pair of spectacles he only wore when alone. Snow had softened the view, turned the front lawn into a clean sheet of paper. "You've the look of your mother after a gale," he said, not unkind. "Hair like a map of the wind and a mind already mending what the storm caught." "I was at the glasshouse," Elizabeth said. "I expected as much." He closed the ledger. The pages whispered. "How bad?" "Not kind," she said, "but not lost." "Good." He pinched the bridge of his nose. Then, as if he were a man choosing how much truth to lay upon his daughter, he tapped the ledger's column with one finger. "Mr. Boyd brings numbers I'd rather not read aloud. The northern pasture didn't yield enough to service the interest. The sawmill wants payment for the planks, and the bank." He left the rest for the silence to finish. "Give me a month," Elizabeth said. The words were out before she could pick each one. "Let me try something." His brow lifted. "Something?" "Rory, Mr. Kincaid, knows a way to draw heat from the compost, to force early greens and flowers. If we salvage more glass, if we work in shifts." "Elizabeth," he said, gentle, "there is only so much an iron frame and goodwill can do." She set her hands on the back of a chair to keep them still. "I know." "And there is also Edmund Blackwood," he said after a moment, as if he were offering not a person but an answer printed in a large clear hand. "He wrote last week. He has kind feelings toward you and kinder feelings toward the estate. He is expected at dinner tonight." The room cooled, though the fire still burned. "Kind," Elizabeth repeated, and tasted the word as if testing whether it would melt on her tongue or cut it. Alastair took off his spectacles. He looked tired and very dear. "I don't barter you," he said. "I have never thought of you as coin, but I am running out of ways to keep what your mother loved from being sold in pieces. Come to dinner. Hear him. Let us both see what he is." Elizabeth's throat worked. "Yes, father." After he dismissed her, she stood for a breath at the door, her palm on the warm wood as if she could anchor herself there. Then she went to the kitchen to send for Nellie, and went, like any child trying to be brave, to let Mrs. Drummond plait her hair smooth. Rory spent the morning in steam and iron. The pipes woke grudgingly, coughing and spitting like old men, then grudgingly warmed to a low hum. He bound the split with a strip cut from an old boot and a length of wire, Mr. Pritchard had kept for when the world comes loose. He packed straw along the coldest seam and set his makeshift cloches, clear jars washed and dried, lantern chimneys repurposed, a cracked bell glass mended with oiled paper, over the weakest plants. Mr. Pritchard limped in by noon, face chapped, finger bandaged to twice its size. He stopped after 2 steps and let out a slow breath. "You've kept her heart beating," he said, and the her meant the house, the roses, the whole green breath of the place. "Didn't like the look of the weather's hands," Rory answered. He did not look up from the seed tray he was firming. "It took what it could from the west side. We gave less from the east." Mr. Pritchard's eyes found the oiled paper patch and the jar cloches. Pride softened his bristle. "You think yourself invisible, lad," he said, "but work shows a man the way a good coat does. Folk see it even when they pretend not to." Rory's cut had bled through the handkerchief. Mr. Pritchard grunted and fetched the bottle the doctor swore by. The sting made Rory hiss. "Mrs. Drummond will finish that," the old man said. "You'll not give the roses your blood and then let the finger go to rot." "I'm for the house, then," Rory said, binding the hand again. He nodded toward the far bed. "The back row's kept. Her ladyship will want to know." "She will," Mr. Pritchard said, and more quietly, "and she should." Elizabeth came in the afternoon, walking as if the floor might remember the night under her boots. She stopped at the back bed with a soft, foolish smile she could not hide. They slept through, Rory said, as if talking to a skittish animal. The worst of them, anyway. Thank you, she answered, and meant not only for the roses. Her hand hovered above the nearest cloche, not touching it, as if warmth could jump from air to skin and back again. Dinner is at 7, she said after a time, and the sentence laid a weight between them that had nothing to do with food or hours. Rory nodded. The winds come round to the south, he said, not because it mattered, but because it was a kind of mercy to say a thing that would not change what followed. She looked at him then, straight on, and he felt the steadiness of that gaze in places his coat did not cover. I'll walk down after, she said, if I can. If you can, he echoed, and went back to work because work held when other things did not. By late day, the estate looked as if it had drawn itself tidy for inspection. Snow swept from steps, coal scuttled up from the yard. In the study, the ledger lay closed. In the halls, lamps burned like a necklace of small suns. In the glasshouse, a single bud had loosened, just a sigh of colour at its seam, winter refusing in its quiet way to be told what to do. Chapter 3. Promises on paper. By late afternoon, the snow had softened to a grey melt at the eaves, and the house put on its company face. Fires were built high, the good linen laid, the silver rubbed until it caught the light like small moons. Aunt Morag supervised with the same command she used for charity teas and family griefs. "Stand still," she said, pinning a jet brooch at Elizabeth's collar. "Black looks sober, not sorrowful, and sober is what we aim for." "I am not a funeral," Elizabeth said, though the dress felt like one. "You are a MacRae," Aunt Morag returned, and smoothed a curl as if she were ironing a crease from silk. "And a MacRae does not answer a question until she knows how to ask a better one." A knock. Nellie appeared with a silver tray and a square envelope thick enough to be important by weight alone. The crest was not theirs. "From Baron Blackwood's man," she said, eyes bright with the drama of it. "He came by the side door, all in a hurry." Aunt Morag broke the seal with a hairpin and passed the letter to Elizabeth. "Read." Elizabeth did, aloud, because it was easier to hold words at arm's length that way. "Lady Elizabeth MacRae, I hope this note finds you and your honourable father recovered from last night's inclemency. It would be my privilege to call this evening as arranged. Permit me the liberty, however, of setting down in writing the spirit of my visit, that we may speak clearly without confusion or embarrassment. It is my earnest wish to be of service. The MacRae name and acres are worth preserving. I admire them both, as I admire your quiet courage. Should you find my regard acceptable, I would propose an alliance that secures your home's future and affords you every comfort a husband may provide. I would request only a modest engagement period and your father's blessing. In the interim, I am at liberty to extend assistance of a financial nature toward immediate concerns. With respect, Edmund Blackwood." Aunt Morag gave a small considering hum. "He knows which fork to use." Elizabeth kept her gaze on the page. The words were gentle and heavy at once, like a hand laid upon a shoulder that was not aching until the weight arrived. "It is kindly phrased," Aunt Morag said, watching her. "That is not always to be distrusted." "Kindness can be a leash," Elizabeth said before she could think better of it. Aunt Morag's mouth pursed, not disapproving so much as thinking. "Then we look to the buckle and decide who holds it." She folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope with clean, capable fingers. "Come, your father will want to know what is written, and the soup will sulk if we keep it waiting." In the hall, the house had drawn itself tall. Laird Alastair stood at the foot of the stairs, dressed formally for the first time in a month, a rose stem cut tidy in the buttonhole where his thumb could find it when he needed steadiness. He read the letter once, and then again, as if flipping a coin and getting the same face each time. "We will hear the man," he said quietly. "We will not sell you." She nodded, and the knot in her throat sat there like a stone, obedient and unmoved. Baron Edmund Blackwood arrived with snow shaken neatly from his coat, and the precise amount of charm a man might pack for such an evening. Dark hair well kept, a fashionable beard trimmed to say he read the papers and owned mills that made those papers. He bowed over Elizabeth's hand without lingering. His smile was quick and bright and did not reach his eyes. "Laird MacRae. Lady Elizabeth. Miss?" Morag MacRae, Aunt Morag supplied briskly and did not curtsy. We read your letter. I am fond of letters. They say what people cannot bring themselves to say out loud. And the opposite, Blackwood said, with an easy tilt of his head. They keep what should be said aloud forever in ink. He offered Elizabeth his arm for the dining room. She took it because the corridor was long and there were too many eyes upon them. Dinner moved as dinners do when conversation has been laid out like silver, courses lifted and set, talk poured carefully, nothing spilled. Blackwood asked after the storm with interest that sounded genuine. He spoke of a new railway spur near his properties farther south and of a charitable fund for fishermen's widows. He listened to Alastair's remarks on crop rotations, nodded in the right places, and made a note of something in a small book with a pencil chased in silver. "You keep records," Elizabeth said, surprised by her own voice. "I keep promises," he said, which was cleverly the same, and yet not at all. Between courses, Mr. Boyd slipped into the room on noiseless shoes to consult the Laird about a delivery. His eyes flicked toward Elizabeth and away again with the practised indifference of a man who knew exactly how much to see. When he withdrew, he paused an inch too long at Blackwood's chair, as if debating whether to speak. Later, as the gentleman took a turn about the table to uncramp politeness, Elizabeth heard the faintest catch of whisper, Mr. Boyd's dry tone, low and useful. "Your lordship will find the lady brave in emergencies. She was at the glasshouse at midnight to save the roses." A harmless sentence, an admiring one even, and yet it set the air colder against Elizabeth's wrists. She could feel the shape of the night in Blackwood's attention when he looked back at her. Curiosity, yes, something appraising behind it. In the drawing-room, tea came, and the kind of conversation that rests upon glossy surfaces. Blackwood drifted to the pianoforte, ran a hand along the closed lid as if testing the varnish, and told a little story about lending his instrument to a parish hall and receiving it back with hymn-book scratches and a jam thumbprint left like a child's confession. "It taught me to choose my charity more carefully," he said with a little laugh. "No good deed and so on. Some deeds are their own reward." Aunt Morag returned and his glance acknowledged the parry. When at last it could be borne no further, Alastair excused himself on the pretext of a ledger and left his daughter to the thing that must be said. Blackwood did not posture, he did not crowd. He stood with one hand loosely at his side and the other resting on the back of the chair. Elizabeth did not sit in. "I meant what I wrote," he said, "and I mean now what cannot be inked easily." A brief breath. "I like you, Lady Elizabeth. I admire your steadiness, your practical mind. You have kept much together that might have fallen. I think we could make a good life." A good life, not a great love. Honesty in that, perhaps, or caution. "You would wish for a short engagement," Elizabeth said, because repetition made sense of things. "I would wish for security all round," he answered with an untroubled smile. "The world rewards decisiveness. And if I were not decisive," he inclined his head, polite to the bone, "then I would remain what my letter promises, useful, patient, and willing to assist until time clarifies." His gaze held hers for the beat after the sentence ended. "I am not without feeling, my lady. I am simply a man who puts feeling where it belongs." "On paper," she said, "if required." His smile deepened, almost rueful. "Your father has fought hard. He should not have to fight alone." The clock chimed the hour, and then the half. By the time his carriage lamps glowed along the drive, the decision Elizabeth had not made felt like a choice all the same. She stood with Aunt Morag in the hall as coats were handed back and hats settled. "He is not ungenerous," Aunt Morag said, watching the door close on him. "No," Elizabeth agreed. The letter lay cool in her pocket. Paper, after all, held warmth only briefly. The house exhaled when the company left. Servants loosened shoulders. Voices rose by a shade. In the kitchen, Nellie repeated the news with the relish of a good story told near a warm range. "At midnight, mind you, in that storm," she said, flour on her cheek like war paint. "Lady Elizabeth, her own self, and Mr. Kincaid with her." "Mind your tongue," Mrs. Drummond said, but not unkindly. "The walls have ears, and some of them belong to Mr. Boyd." Nellie clapped a hand over her mouth, which did not stop the glow in her eyes. "Stories are flint, they strike, and something catches." Elizabeth put on her cloak in the side hall, the one that smelled faintly of beeswax and damp wool. She did not tell herself she was walking for air, or that she needed to check the vents. She was simply wholly drawn, like a moth to the small, warm rectangle she knew would be shining in the dark. The night had settled. Snow gave back a weak, steady light. Her boots printed the path she had walked before. At the glasshouse door she paused, hand on the cold iron, listening. The wind was a whisper now. Inside, the lantern made its soft circle. Rory looked up from a tray of cuttings. He did not startle or smile. He simply rose, as if one stands when a truth walks in. "How was dinner?" he asked, as if the word did not weigh a stone. "Very polite," she said, and let out a breath she had held for hours, and full of promises. "On paper," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved once. She stepped closer to the back bed. A bud had pushed farther, a secret spoken one syllable more. Elizabeth's hand hovered the way it had before, her palm a breath above the cloche. "They keep their own time," Rory said softly. "Flowers." "So do people," she answered, and that was as much as either of them dared. Chapter 4. A Gardener's Hands. Morning laid a thin gold edge along the glasshouse panes. Breath misted and vanished. The pipes murmured like a cat. Elizabeth stood with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, feeling half like a trespasser and half like someone come home. Rory set a tray between them, clay pots, a pan of clean sand and loam, a narrow-bladed knife polished to a dull shine. He had tied a fresh rag around his nicked knuckle. The cut looked neat, the kind a day forgets until it opens again. "You said you'd show me," Elizabeth began, and then faltered. It was not the words so much as the distance between them they had not quite learned how to measure. "I will," he said. "We'll start with a heel cutting, quick to take if you're kind to it." He chose a strong-side shoot from her mother's shrub and brought it close to the light. "See the node," he said, touching the place where leaf and stem made a quiet V. "We cut just below. Slant, not flat. Water will run, rot won't sit." He offered her the knife by the handle. Sharp does less harm than dull. The knife had the honest weight of a tool that had been used well. Her gloves made her clumsy. She peeled them off and set them aside. "Won't you freeze?" he asked. "I'm warmer without them," she said, and he accepted that without fuss. Elizabeth lined the blade and breathed the way she had when the storm rattled the roof. The cut came clean. Her heart leapt, absurdly pleased. Good. He did not praise like a man tossing treats to a pet. He said it as one worker to another. "Now nip off the lower leaves. Leave two. Too many mouths and it starves." He touched one leaf, light as a moth. "We'll use willow water instead of powder. Mr. Pritchard swears by it. The willow lends what it knows about rooting." "Things remember kindness," she said before she could stop herself. "They do," he answered, and the small silence after gave the words room. They worked, a gentle rhythm. Cut, strip, dip, set. His hands were steady, brown with ground-in loam. Hers were paler, with the faint dusting of flour Mrs. Drummond's kitchen left on everything. He showed her how to firm the sand around the stem with 2 fingers, how to slide the pot to the warmest bench, how to tip a jar cloche over without knocking the plant. "Too tight and it sweats," he said. "Too loose and it goes thirsty." "The middle," she said. "Always the middle." Near enough. He watched her place the last cloche. She didn't fumble. Pride warmed her skin in a way the pipes could not. "You'll check them daily," he said. "Lift the glass a finger's breadth. Air's as much a food as water." "I thought gardeners lived by secrets," she said, smiling despite herself. "Old recipes and muttered spells." He tipped his head. "Only the kind that are made of patience." They cleaned their tools, that small finishing ritual that made an hour feel complete. As Elizabeth wiped the blade, her thumb slipped. The knife kissed skin. A bright bead welled at the edge. Rory took her hand without asking, so brief and sure that the touch felt more like a correction than an intimacy. "Hold still." He wrapped the clean end of his rag around her thumb and tied a tidy knot with the ease of a man who had mended more than plants. "There," he said softly. "You'll keep the rest of your fingers." "It hardly stings." "It will later," he said, and only then released her. Mr. Pritchard's limp announced him before his voice did. He came in with the air of a general inspecting a field after battle. His gaze dropped to the tray of neatly set pots and rose, surprised and satisfied at once. "Lady Elizabeth," he said, and gave her a short, respectful nod that meant competent, not merely present. "You've put the cuttings down straight." Rory showed me, she said. He would. Mr. Pritchard shifted his weight, settling. There's a line a man has to keep, lad. He spoke to Rory, but he did not pretend Elizabeth could not hear. Kindness reads like courting to eyes that want a story. You've no room for stories that turn on you. Rory's jaw worked once. I? Mr. Pritchard's look softened a shade. And you, my lady, folk who cannot tell compost from cake will judge your hands dirty for touching either. Walk in daylight. Let Aunt Morag scold while she can still shield. He lifted his bandaged finger. This place needs you both. Don't let gossip be the frost that gets in under the door. Elizabeth had the odd wish to curtsy to him. Instead, she inclined her head and said, We will be careful. Careful enough, he returned, which was as close to blessing as he gave in ordinary hours. He stumped away to check the vents, muttering to the hinges like old friends. The bench between Elizabeth and Rory felt shorter and longer all at once. She smoothed the damp rag at her thumb and said, because she could think of nothing else that would not break the room, Mrs. Drummond says the cook is sulking because the lemon ice will not set in this weather. Rory huffed a laugh. Tell her to set the bowl on the north step. The wind off the fields will finish it. She would if Mr. Boyd didn't insist the front look as if winter never touched it. Rory's face went still, the way it did when something useful ought not be said. He's particular. About the wrong things, she said, before she remembered that Mr. Boyd was paid to be a wall. I didn't mean. You did, he said, and the honesty of it untied something between her ribs. And you were not wrong. They walked the rows one last time. She lifted a cloche and felt the faintest change in air, new breath in the little world under glass. When they reached her mother's rose, he stood back and let her tend it alone. Elizabeth adjusted the shawl, leaving that thumb's width gap. She set her palm above the leaves and felt how warmth rises. Thank you, she said, for the lesson. He shook his head. For coming, for wanting to learn. Most folk only want to have. He carried the empty tray to the door. She followed, not quite ready to go, not quite willing to stay. Snow began again, a sift, nothing like the storm, just enough to remind the world that winter had not spent all its changes. Tomorrow, she asked. If you wish, he said, we'll try hardwood cuttings. Slower, worth it. So are people, she said, and looked away, embarrassed by her own echo. He reached and lifted the latch for her, a small courtesy that felt like a vow. Mind the step. She stepped down into the thin new snow. Behind her, the glasshouse held its soft light, a lantern stitched into the white. Ahead lay the house and letters and a baron with kind words arranged like soldiers on a page. Between the two, she walked with her bandaged thumb and the lesson sitting warm in her hands. Cut clean, set steady, leave air enough to breathe. Chapter 5. Lessons in Breath. The cold slipped back at dawn, soft and sly, as if the storm had left a hand behind to test the locks. Elizabeth felt it on her face before she touched the door. Inside, the glasshouse wore a pale film. Not ice, not yet, but the idea of it. The pipes muttered. The lemon geranium by the bench offered its clean scent like a handkerchief to a crying child. Rory was already there, sleeves pushed up, hair damp from the pump. He had set a pan of water on the brick run over the pipe to warm, and a stack of burlap lay folded like brown blankets. We'll do hardwood cuttings after, he said, not lifting his voice above the hush the cold had made. First, we keep what we have. Elizabeth went straight to the back bed. The cloches held their small worlds, but a faint white bloom had formed at the rim of one, thin as lace, cruel as knives if you let it spread. It's frosting, she said, and her chest tightened as if someone had tugged a string there. Rory was beside her in 3 steps. Not yet, he said. It's thinking about it. He lifted the cloche, slow and steady, cold curled in. He set the glass aside and laid his palm above the bud the way she had learned to do a hover, not a press. His breath came slow, the kind used to calm horses. Elizabeth couldn't copy it. Her own breath soared too high, too fast. She could hear the storm night in her ears, though the air was still. Look at me, he said, quiet as soil. Count with me. In for 4. Hold. Out for 6. We'll be the warm thing in the room until the room remembers how. She did, clumsy at first, then better. In. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2. Out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Her shoulders let go a fraction. Rory lifted a damp burlap square and gave it to her. Lay it like a roof, he said. Not too tight, leave a thumb of space. Yes. He poured a line of the warmed water into a shallow pan and slid it under the bench. Steam rose, thin and steady. Heat and breath, he said. That's all we are this hour. They set a small procession of pans along the run, each one a quiet chimney. He opened the compost bay, let its sweet animal warmth sigh into the aisle, and built a low wall of straw to hold it near the beds. The glass fogged by degrees. The frost lace on the rim blurred, then wept. Elizabeth's breath steadied with it. She hadn't known panic could be walked like a dog, taken to heel by numbers and tasks. She laid another burlap square, lifted another cloche a finger's breadth, wiped the inside with her sleeve where water purled and threatened to drip on a tender leaf. "Good," Rory murmured. "Keep the air moving. We don't want rain under the glass." "Does it always come back like this?" she asked, not sure whether she meant cold or fear. "In February, it tries," he said. "We try back." They worked along the row, 2 small furnaces in a chill church. Mr. Pritchard appeared, took one look, and set to sealing a seam with oiled paper without asking a question. His presence steadied the room the way a third hand can steady a ladder. The worst passed in half an hour that felt like 2. The frost lace melted into nothing. The buds, so slight, so stubborn, held their colour. Elizabeth drew a hand from above the last one and felt the ghost of heat on her palm. "Better," Rory said, and only then did he let the breath leave him in a long, unseen sigh. He wiped the fog from a pane with the side of his hand, looked out at the yard glazed white and back at her. "You were quick. I was frightened." The admission came easier than she had expected. It was the kind that didn't shame you once it was spoken. "That's a kind of quick," he said. "You felt the change. You came." She opened her mouth to say "we," then let it go, because that word had teeth she wasn't sure she was ready to feel. She tucked the last edge of burlap into place and smoothed it as if it were a blanket over a sleeping child. "We can try the hardwood cuttings now?" she asked, grateful for the ordinary. "In a bit," he said. "Let them take this in." He rested his cut hand on the bench, as if easing pressure. The bandage was cleaner today. The Baron came again? Last night. She kept her gaze on the cloche. He spoke of security, of a short engagement, of assistance. Each word went down like a stone dropped into a well. Rory's hands did not change their work. He adjusted the straw wool by a thumb's width. He nudged a pan so its steam rose in a better line. Only his jaw gave him away, a small knot that came and went. "What did you say?" he asked at last. "That I would think," Elizabeth said. "That I would speak to my father. That I would not be hurried." "And what do you want?" He made it sound practical, like asking whether to prune or to wait. She tried to answer and found herself standing inside too many doors at once. The house and its portraits, her mother's shawl, her father's tired hand flattening a ledger page, the December night when glass fell and someone's arm had come around her without asking, the bud lifting its small green fist against the cold. Want felt like a forbidden word in a language she had only read about. "I want the glasshouse to live," she said, which was true and not enough. "I want not to be pressed like flowers between 2 sheets of paper." Rory's mouth tipped, not quite a smile. He watched the steam rise, which let her speak without drowning in his eyes. "You deserve a choice," he said. Elizabeth looked at him. "Do you?" He looked back, and for a moment his face was naked as the sky over the fields, no hedge, no cover. Then he set the hedges back in place with care. "I have work," he said simply. "It's the thing I can keep." The words did not sting as she feared they would. They steadied. She could set her feet on them. Mr. Pritchard, who could hear what was not said from 30 paces, cleared his throat in a way that meant nothing and everything. "The vents are true," he announced. "The oiled paper will do. We'll lift the burlap by noon if the sun obliges." "Thank you," Elizabeth said, and the thanks stirred more air than it should have. They stood quietly for a little while, a triangle of breath and work and steam. The pipes purred. A drop gathered at the edge of the cloche and fell, not on the leaf but just beside it, harmless like a missed note that no one marks down if the song is strong enough. "Hardwood cuttings," Rory said at last, as if they had both agreed to step back onto the path that had brought them here. "Slower, like I told you. The wood keeps its own counsel a while, then decides." "Like people," she said, and did not blush this time. They took the bundle of last year's rosewood and cut pieces the length of a hand, slanted at the top, square at the heel. The knife sat easier now. Her cut was clean. His nod was small and full. They set the sticks in a trench of sand and loam along the warmest run. When Elizabeth pressed the earth around one, she felt, under the cool surface, that living heat, the slow, patient engine that had taught her this morning how to breathe. By noon the glass had cleared to a soft shine. The burlap lifted like a curtain at the end of a scene. The buds, unbitten, held their green. Outside the yard glittered. Inside it smelled of earth and lemon and something else she could not name. Hope, perhaps, when it is not a banner but a small lamp. Rory carried the empty pans to the door. "You did well," he said. "We did," she answered, and this time the word did not bite. He held the latch for her again. "Mind the step." She stepped out into the clean cold and felt it meet her without conquering her. Behind her the glasshouse breathed, a long, deep, steadying breath, and she matched it and went to face whatever paper the day might lay before her. Chapter 6. The Debt Comes Due. The day began with figures and finished with a bruise. By mid-morning the study felt smaller than its walls. Mr. Boyd stood at the desk with his ledger open like a priest's book, voice dry as paper. "Candlemas has come and gone," he said. "Interest stands and the bank signals no patience. The note itself matures at Whitsunday." His finger tapped a neat column. "We are short by more than a handful of shillings." Alastair listened without sitting, as if a chair would give way under such numbers. "I know what we're short of," he said, weary and wry. "What do you recommend, Mr. Boyd?" The factor's eyes were careful. "Baron Blackwood has intimated that he could consolidate the debt at fair rates, swiftly." He closed the ledger with a sound like a lid. "He speaks of an engagement. A public announcement at Easter would soothe our creditors." Elizabeth stood by the window, her hands tight in her sleeves. Mr. Boyd had not asked for her presence. Aunt Morag had assured it. "If Easter is the key," Elizabeth said, finding a steady tone, "then we have weeks. Rory Kincaid's forcing beds could bring early greens to market. The glasshouse can be mended faster if we reclaim panes from the old orangery. We could sell bouquets and seedlings as well as produce. People will pay for spring in February." Mr. Boyd did not quite turn his head. "The staff is already pressed, my lady. Then we press our ingenuity," Aunt Morag said from the hearth, crisp as flint. "We have that in surplus." Alastair rubbed a thumb over the rose in his buttonhole. "We will attempt the forcing scheme," he said at last, "and I will speak with Blackwood about terms that do not include my daughter's name written as collateral." Mr. Boyd bowed the precise inch required and left a neat silence behind him. In it, Elizabeth heard the pipes thrum and the faint hiss of snow slipping from a gutter. Numbers have their own weather. That afternoon the house breathed in and out around errands. Mr. Pritchard sent for old sash weights. Rory hauled them to the glasshouse to anchor the worst damaged frames. Nellie bore trays like battleships. Aunt Morag wrote 3 letters in a hand that could have sliced butter colder than iron. Elizabeth walked the long corridor with a basket of rags under her arm and the sense of time tightening its belt. Blackwood arrived before the lamps were lit, a hawk's punctuality rather than a guest's. He brought weather in with him, the crisp of wool, the cold order of a man who had not bent to the day. "My apologies for the hour," he said to the butler, who fetched Alastair without question. Papers lay under Blackwood's arm, cream and heavy and sure of themselves. In the study, he set them down and spoke in the easy cadence of solutions. "A short note to clear the arrears. A longer instrument to take the bank's place. I've spoken with the manager in town. He's amenable if we move promptly." Alastair read with his spectacles low. "And the price?" "Prudence," Blackwood said, smiling. "We announce Easter Monday. A wedding in June is handsome. Your tenants will take heart." Aunt Morag's brow lifted a fraction. "Tenants prefer roofs that do not leak." "Which is what I'm offering," he returned smoothly. Elizabeth slipped out on the pretext of sending for tea. In the half-lit corridor the hush seemed full, as if the house were listening to itself breathe. She had taken 2 steps when Blackwood's shadow folded into the lamplight. "Lady Elizabeth," he said, and stopped close enough that the cold steamed off his coat and met the warmth of the hall. He did not touch her. He did not need to for his nearness to be felt. You left your father to read without you, he went on, conversational. Wise. Men like to decide and then present their daughters with triumph rather than debate. I prefer to read before others do, she said, levelled as a rule. His gaze softened, or seemed to. So do I, which is why I put things on paper. He leaned a fraction, as if the walls themselves would keep the words between them. I like you, Lady Elizabeth. I like your steadiness under weather. I like that you went to the glasshouse in the storm and did not ask for praise. I like that you speak of work as if it were not beneath you. Compliment as coin, she could hear it clink. But, he said gently, the world is not made of likes. It is made of terms. Allow me to shield you from the uglier ones. Take my name. Take my help. I'm not a patient man, but I am a practical one, and I know a good match when I see it. He reached as if to straighten the ribbon at her collar, a small familiarity that had not been offered. Elizabeth stepped back the inch she had. The gesture was tiny and loud. His eyes marked it. Something cooled there, like tea left too long. Forgive me, he said, the smile still exact on his mouth. I forget that not everyone likes the world as brisk as I do. Brisk is a wind, Mrs. Drummond said, arriving with the tea tray balanced on her hip, voice mild as milk. It chaps when it comes too close. She set the cups on a side table with neat clinks. His lordship will take it with sugar? One, he said, and did not look annoyed. He looked amended. He stepped back the required pace and became the man rooms were built to receive. Elizabeth poured without spilling. Her hands were steady, her stomach was not. Mrs. Drummond did not glance at her, which was its own kindness. By the time the tray reached the study, terms had been discussed into plainness. Alastair looked tired and taller, as if a rod of something had been set behind his spine. We will consider your offer, he said. We will not be hurried. Of course, Blackwood said. Easter, then. He took the cup from Elizabeth with a small bow that any footman would have envied for its perfection. You make a good tea, my lady. After he left, the house let out a breath like a dog settling. Aunt Morag closed the door and turned, assessing. A man who moves faster than the kettle, she said. Dangerous for pastry and people. Alastair rubbed his brow. He is not unkind. He is not unkind, Aunt Morag agreed. That is not the same as good. Elizabeth walked out into the dusk on legs that wanted earth. The path to the glasshouse had become a habit her body kept even when her mind scattered. Inside, the heat was a low hum. The lemon leaf gave its clean handkerchief again. Rory stood up from the sash he was waiting, and in his face she found the one thing the day had not offered, unscripted concern. Are you all right? He asked, simple as water. Yes, she said, and then, because the day had already taken too much from the truth, not quite. He nodded, not asking. He held out a length of line. Tie that for me. Left side, third pane. We'll make it hold through the night. She tied, and the knot sat neat, and the bruise the day had left began, just to fade. Chapter 7. Budbreak. The first sign was small enough to miss. Swelling at the base of a rose stem where leaf would be, green deepening as if a secret had been told there. Elizabeth bent until her breath fogged the glass and smiled before she could stop herself. Budbreak, Rory said behind her, the word gentle as a blessing. It wants to move. So do we, she answered, and straightened with a decision that set her spine. By noon she had her father in the glasshouse, with his coat collar up and his spectacles on, and Mr. Boyd hovering like a tidy crow at the aisle's edge. Rory stood easy near the compost bay, cap in hand, not deferent so much as steady. We can build hotbeds, Elizabeth said, palms open so she wouldn't grip her ideas too tight. Dung and straw layered for heat, salvage glass from the old orangery. Sash frames mended with oiled paper and wire. We'll force salad greens, radishes, early peas, and cut narcissus and primulas for bouquets. We sell them in town while snow still sits on the kirkyard wall. People will pay for spring when winter is not finished with them. Alastair looked from his daughter to the long beds and back again. Cost? Minimal, Elizabeth said. Labour, which we have if we shift hours. The dung from Macfarlane's stables. He'll trade for coal. Straw from our own loft. Glass we reclaim. If we must buy panes, only a handful. Mr. Boyd drew breath. My lady, this is not the time for ingenuity, Aunt Morag said, appearing at Elizabeth's shoulder with the neat inevitability of sunrise. It is exactly the time. Go on, child. Rory spoke then, careful and clear. "A hotbed holds at blood warm for 6 weeks if built right. We lay a 2 feet, straw, dung, straw again, work it with the fork and set frames over. We sew into boxes first, moth transplant when the heat steadies. The pipes give background warmth. The beds do the work." Mr. Boyd's mouth pressed into a seam. "And who will repair the orangery frames? They're rot from the sill up." "I will," Rory said. "Supervised," Mr. Pritchard added from the doorway, his limp more pronounced in the cold. "And with my say-so. The lad's hand is truer than yours with a hammer, Boyd, and that's charity speaking." Alastair put a hand to his buttonhole rose as if feeling for a pulse. "A trial," he said at last. 2 frames this week. If they warm and hold, double to 4, we'll see what mark it will bear." Mr. Boyd bowed the inch required. "As you wish, Laird." They set to at once, because hope, once named, refuses to be left idle. Rory and the gardeners hauled barrows of straw that smelled of summer barns into the yard behind the glasshouse. Stable boys arrived with steaming barrows from McFarlane's, cheeks red, laughter quick, the way it is when work is heavy and honest. The first shovel load hit the straw with a wet thud, steam lifted like breath from a running horse. "Fork through," Rory called, and Elizabeth did, sleeves rolled, Aunt Morag's old shawl pinned over her dress. The men's glance slid to her hands and then away again when Mr. Pritchard said, without looking up, "Mind your own feet and let the lady keep hers." They layered and turned until the heap glowed faintly in the cold air. The smell was rank and sweet, alive. Mr. Pritchard stuck his bare arm into the centre and came up smiling like a man discovering a coal in spent ash. "Aye," he said, "there's the stove." They tamped the mound into a frame-wide bed, tramped it level and set the salvaged sashes over, patched, imperfect, sufficient. Rory pushed a thermometer into the mix, glanced, and nodded. "We wait for it to cool to a hand's warmth. Then boxes go on." Inside, Elizabeth and Nellie wiped soil onto fingers and the corners of cheeks without noticing. Mrs. Drummond marshalled mugs of tea and scolded anyone who tried to carry 2 at once. Aunt Morag tied back her veil with a pin and sorted seed into saucers with the concentration of a general arranging cavalry: cress, mustard, radish, early pea. By mid-afternoon, a carriage rolled up with a crispness that made the yard look shabby by contrast. Baron Blackwood stepped down, all correct lines and good leather, and paused with the faintest smile at the sight of Elizabeth, cloaked, hair escaping its pins, straw on her skirt. "Lady Elizabeth," he said, "you've found an occupation." "A season's chance," she returned, and did not offer apology. He took in the steaming beds, the patched glass, the busy yard, and arranged his face into polite approval. "Industrious. I admire enterprise." "We admire results," Aunt Morag said, and inclined her head just enough for propriety. "Of course," he said, and the quick, bright smile did that almost thing it did, almost kind, almost warm. "May I speak with your father?" "In the study," Elizabeth said. She did not offer her arm. He did not ask. When he had gone, the yard seemed to breathe again. Toward evening, the heat in the bed steadied, right on the instrument and in the palm, a low, animal warmth that promised more than it said. Rory tapped the side of a wooden box. "Ready to sew." "Let me," Elizabeth asked, and he moved aside at once. She pinched a line of tiny seeds into the furrow he had drawn with a finger. They fell like brown punctuation into the dark. She covered them with sifted soil so gently you might have thought she were tucking children to sleep. The box slid onto the bed, frame over, oiled paper patched where the glass still gaped. Another box, another line of quiet hope. Night came early, as it does in February even when the calendar argues otherwise. Lamps threw warm lozenges on snow. The glasshouse glowed like a thought held in cupped hands. Alastair returned from his talk with Blackwood with his mouth set and his eyes kind for all that. "A fortnight," he said, clapping Rory's shoulder as if he were any man and not a servant. "Show me something a banker will understand and a factor cannot deny." "We'll do our best," Rory said, and did not add. "We're already doing it," though Elizabeth heard it. Mr. Boyd kept his silence, which was almost as good as blessing. They worked until the world shrank to the circle of their breath. When the last box was set and the frames waited, Elizabeth stepped back and felt the kind of tired that makes sleep clean. She looked at Rory and found him watching the beds, that rare light in his face he had when a thing was right and no one had ruined it yet. "You believe in this," she said, not a question. "I believe in what grows if given the chance," he answered, then glanced at her hand as if to ask without words whether the bandaged thumb held. It did. "Tomorrow," she said. "We'll check at dawn." "Dawn, then." He lifted the latch for her as he always did, a small rite that had become theirs. Outside, the cold felt less sharp. Elizabeth walked up toward the house, straw on her hem and the smell of warm earth still in her hair. Behind her, the frames held their heat. Under the thin skin of glass and oiled paper, seeds listened, and something in her did the same. Chapter 8. A Name for the Rose. By the third morning, the hotbeds breathed like sleeping beasts. Lift a frame, and warmth rose to meet the face. Tip a seed box, and the first threads of green showed, pale and certain as veins beneath skin. Elizabeth bent over one row until her shadow made a small eclipse and laughed, quiet, astonished, as cress lifted like a crowd of tiny hands. Rory watched the same way a man watches a foal take weight, pleased, careful not to spook hope by shouting at it. "They've taken," he said. "We'll thin tomorrow." "Not yet," Elizabeth whispered, greedy for the sight of more rather than fewer. She straightened and went to the back bed as if some part of her walked there of its own wanting. The cuttings sat where they had been set, an ordered village of little bells and pots. Under one jar, the heel had thrown a white nub, blunt as a knuckle. New root. Elizabeth's throat closed. She lifted the cloche with both hands as if she were receiving something holy. "This one's quick," Rory said, bending beside her. "Strong wood. It likes the place." "My mother's line does not give up easily," Elizabeth answered, and stroked air above the two tender leaves. "We should mark it," Rory said, practical and strangely gentle, "so it isn't lost in the crowd when more wake." "How?" She glanced at the scattered labels, already smudged by damp fingers. Rory reached into the breast of his coat and drew out a little scrap of paper, the corner of some old account. With a stub of carpenter's pencil, he etched 3 strokes that became a rose in the simplest language. 5 petals, a tight heart, 2 small leaves. He set a dot of winter shadow under each leaf, as if to say this is a plant that lives when cold thinks it will not. "Like that," he said, and because he could not help himself, he refined the line where a petal tucked under another. "If we cut a stamp, we could mark the boxes. Folks remember a sign quicker than a name." Elizabeth could not stop looking. The drawing was not clever, not fancy, but it sat right, as if it had always existed in the air above the beds and he had only caught it there. "A sign," she repeated, and knew at once what it should be called. Winter Rose. Rory's head tipped, approving, as if she had chosen the only true word in a list of pretenders. "Aye." She held the scrap, careful of the fresh graphite. His hand hovered the length of a breath too long before he let it go, and when their fingers touched at last, it was so slight a meeting that the nerves in her palm sang all the same. They both looked down as if cramped by politeness they had not written. "Her Ladyship," Mr. Pritchard called from the aisle, mercifully busy. "If you've a mind to tell your aunt what you've named the thing, she'll get it into people's heads before dinner." Aunt Morag did not wait for telling. She entered like a useful draught, veil pinned back, gloves off, cheeks bright from the walk. "What have you christened?" she asked, and when Elizabeth said it, the name fitted in her aunt's mouth too. "Winter Rose. Good. Close to poetry without the trouble." She took the scrap from Elizabeth's hand and held it at arm's length. "Clear enough to stamp on a crate. Can we make it a brand?" "We can cut a potato stamp for now," Rory said. "Ink will do. Proper block later if there's time." Aunt Morag's eyes flicked between their faces and down to Elizabeth's ungloved hands, which were clean only in the way a worker's are, soil at the half-moons, a faint green rub where cress had stained. Her gaze was not scolding, it was measuring how much cover to throw and how quickly. "Excellent," she said, decision made. "And you, child, will come up to the dressmaker at 4. I will not have Mr. Boyd declaring the family's ruin because a lady went to market with earth on her knuckles. We'll make town ready what needs to be seen, and we'll leave what matters where it is." Elizabeth almost laughed, from relief or mutiny she could not tell. "Yes, Aunt." "Rory," Aunt Morag added, his name neat in her mouth, not Mr. Kincaid this time. "Send someone up with the first decent bunch of cress and a sprig of that primula when it's fit. I'll see they're remarked upon in the right places." Rory touched the brim of his cap. "Aye, Miss Morag." After she had gone, the glasshouse felt larger for a moment and then smaller again, the way rooms do when a determined person exits, leaving air that still remembers orders. "She's right," Rory said, when Elizabeth did not quite manage words. "About hands and markets, about leaving what matters." "What matters?" Elizabeth echoed and looked down at the little stamp again. It made a promise without saying how. "Will you show me?" He fetched a firm potato from the kitchen basket Nellie had left for his dinner and cut it clean in two. With the knife he had taught her to use, he scored the rose in shallow shore lines, petals, heart, leaves, and lifted the spare flesh away until a raised shape stood. He inked it with a pad of stove black and pressed it onto brown paper. When he peeled the potato back, the rose sat there, companionable and plain, not pleading, not shouting, present. Elizabeth smiled outright. "Again," she said, and together they stamped a small parade. Papers to tie onto boxes, stiff labels for the potted seedlings, a square of muslin that would make a pretty pocket for Cress if she could persuade Mrs. Drummond to spare the cloth. Their hands brushed twice, maybe 3 times, and each time both drew back as if the air were made suddenly of nettles. Mr. Boyd came to the door, not stepping in, his ledger hugged to his chest the way a chilly man hugs a hot brick. His eyes went to the inked papers, the trimmed frames, the steaming beds, then to Elizabeth's bare hands and the small bandage still neat on her thumb. "Progress, my lady," he said, which was praise from him. "May I remind you the accounts will not be impressed by artistry." "They will, however, be affected by sales," Elizabeth returned, gentle as milk. "We mean to make some." He weighed her tone, polite, firm, and nodded once, filing it somewhere in his careful mind. "Very good." His glance landed on Rory, flicked away. "Carry on." When he was gone, Elizabeth felt the room exhale. She picked up the scrap with the original sketch and slipped it into the pocket sewn under her skirt, the secret one only she and Mrs. Drummond knew. She could not have said why that felt like armour. 4 o'clock, she said, a little rueful. Needles and pins. Rory's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, not quite the thing that comes after. "You'll look well," he said, then added, to make it safe, "for market." "For market," she agreed, because the world liked its reasons tidy. Before she left, she checked the quick cutting once more. The white nub had lengthened enough to pretend to be a root in truth. She set the cloche back and left a thumb of air, the way he had taught her. "Grow," she said under her breath. To the plant or to herself she couldn't say. At 4, she climbed the house steps washed clean of straw and earth. Aunt Morag and the dressmaker clicked and measured, swapped one sober ribbon for another that caught the light like a promise. They talked of hems and hats and the proper gloves for a lady who wished to be seen as practical without being thought common. Elizabeth said yes when required, and when a no would be too much, like a stone in a stream. When she went back down at dusk, the glasshouse lamps were already lit. Rory had stamped 2 brown paper wrappers and tied them with string, a sprig tucked beneath, cress and the first primula, pale as the inside of a shell. "For your aunt," he said, passing the parcels as one passes bread. His fingers did not touch hers this time. He had learned the room too well. Elizabeth took them and felt the weight of very little, the kind of weight that changes things all the same. "Winter Rose," she said. "Winter Rose," he answered, and the name warmed the night between them like a small, durable fire. Chapter 9. The Market Day Test. They set out before the lamps were doused on the high street, wheels whispering on frost, crates roped tight in the cart. Rory walked at the horse's shoulder, breath ghosting. Elizabeth rode up front beside Aunt Morag, gloved and neat, a simple hat pinned firm, a scarf tucked so its edge did not look like a plea. The square woke as they arrived, iron shoes striking, shutters clapping, a fishwife's laugh that could split ice. Granite held the night's cold, baking drifted warm from a door left ajar. They took a stall at the kirkyard wall, where the wind broke and the light would come first. Rory and Mr. Pritchard raised trestles. Nellie laid brown paper stamped with the small rose Rory had cut from a potato. Aunt Morag arranged the primulas so their pale throats faced outward, each pot clean as a teacup. Elizabeth tied the first bundle of cress with a twist of string and slipped one stamped label under, a neat sign no larger than a thumb. Prices, Aunt Morag said, brisk, and Elizabeth named them, not shy. Cress, 3p a bunch, mustard the same, radishes, when they're up, 4p. Primulas a shilling. She cleared her throat. 2 for 1.06. Charm, not charity, Aunt Morag murmured. Smile because it's spring, not because you're sorry. The first buyer came because she always did, a seamstress with her measuring tape like a ribbon about her neck. She picked up the cress as one picks up an infant's hand. Green in February, she said, wonder softening the edges of her week. I'll have 2. Coins kissed the tin. The sound struck something in Elizabeth's chest she did not have a word for. They did not shout their wares. They let the colour and the small clean scent do the speaking, pots like cups of light, leaves the green of new ink. Children dragged reluctant fathers by the sleeve to see. A young man bought a primula and went red when Nellie wished him luck with whoever's to have it. An elderly lady sniffed, declared the air improved, and bought 3 bunches of cress for her invalid sister because cheer is a tonic if the doctor won't be. Rory kept to the back of the stall, hands quick, eyes on the boxes, as if stock were a tide that must be watched or it would drown them. When Elizabeth needed more paper or a fresh pot, he set it within reach without making a show of it. Once, when a stray gust tried to lift the labels, his palm came down over the little rose stamp and held it steady. The touch left the faintest smudge of ink on his skin. Gossip arrived with the flour and salt, as it always did. 2 ladies paused, hats neat enough to suggest they had brought opinions to match. A lady selling greens, the first murmured to the other, loud enough for the stones to hear. Next she'll be shouting in the market like a fishwife. Better she sell spring than sit in a house and pretend she can buy it, Aunt Morag said, so pleasantly that the words landed like a courtesy. The ladies blinked, half ashamed, half satisfied at being noticed, and bought a primula each rather than lose face. By 11, the tin had weight. Elizabeth felt it through the wood as she moved the box to make room for more pots. She had not known that coin could feel like breath in metal, warmth collecting, proof that need and answer had touched hands. Lady Elizabeth, someone said, and she looked up to find a mill girl in a shawl mended with small, fierce stitches. The girl's gloves were worn to the thread at the fingertips. How much for the littlest pot? For my mum. Elizabeth glanced at Aunt Morag, who gave the barest nod. For your mother, Elizabeth said, holding out the smallest primula as if it had been grown for this one pair of hands. It's 6p. The girl fumbled and found exact coin, earned, not begged, and went away straighter than she'd come. Elizabeth watched her pass within sight of the kirkyard gate and felt the day tilt in her favour. Near noon, a gentleman in a good coat lingered at the edge of the crowd and did not come nearer. His boots were new, his watch chain spoke before he did. He nodded once when Elizabeth met his eyes and went on without buying. Mr. Boyd, at some distance, made a note in his pocket-book as if recording the weather. "Sell out," Rory said under his breath, low as advice to a shy plant, "before the wind thinks again." They did. The last of the cress went to a baker's wife who promised to lay it under eggs as if spring could be eaten. Elizabeth set aside 1 pot she could not bear to part with and then made herself let it go, because that was the point. The table breathed emptiness. The stamp papers had all been tied. The tin was heavier than anyone said. Elizabeth was still counting change when a shadow cut the light, precise as a blade. "May I?" Baron Blackwood's voice, light and easy, as if he had found himself at market by accident rather than intent. He took in the cleared board, the neat remains, the paper stamped with the small rose. He looked as if any weather would be improved by his standing in it. "We've only the one," Elizabeth said. A single bouquet of narcissus and primula, tied with string, a ribbon of brown paper stamped with the rose. It smelled like a room opened after winter to let the sea in. "Just the one," he repeated, and paid for it with a coin that made Aunt Morag's brows flick for the briefest of moments. "A triumph," he said to Elizabeth. "I am very impressed." "Thank you," she said, even, because this was the square and everyone looked. Rory had gone still behind the stall. He did not lower his gaze. He did not move at all, which was a movement in itself. Blackwood turned the bouquet once in his fingers as if judging the weight of it. "A sign," he said, tipping the brown paper where the rose sat. "You've a talent for names." "It's the plant that earned it," Elizabeth answered. "But it is you they'll remember," he said, and for a moment something like warning or promise warmed the words. He bowed properly and turned away, the bouquet held just so. The carriage waited at the far end of the square. Blackwood climbed in, shut the door on the cold, and sat with the flowers in his lap. He watched the stall a moment longer, eyes narrowed the way a man reads a difficult account. Then his gloved hand tightened, once. White petals creased under black leather. He eased his grip before the stems broke. When he let himself smile again, it was small and perfect and gave nothing away. Back at the stall, Elizabeth set the lid on the tin and held it down with both palms before she trusted herself to lift it. The weight steadied her. She smiled at Rory without meaning to, the relief of it untaming her face. "We did it," she said. "We did," he answered, and the short words held the whole morning. Breath on glass, ink on paper, coins like a heartbeat in a metal box. Chapter 10. What the Night Carried. The sky went iron clear at dusk, a warning the bones of the house heard if no one else did. By midnight, the yard crackled when a fox crossed it. Toward morning, frost walked down from the hills and laid its hand on everything that breathed. Elizabeth woke before the bell, the way one does when a thought has teeth. She dressed in the half-light and ran the path with her shawl tight under her cloak, the cold bright and cruel in her nose. The glasshouse stood bright as a lantern and wrong in a way she could not name until she put her palm to the door. Inside, air bit. "Rory?" Her voice came small. The answer was a crack, then the hiss of his breath as if he'd put it abruptly back inside him. He was at the back bed already working, burlap in his hands. "Mr." Pritchard crouched at the vents with a length of oiled paper and a face grey as the morning. The pipes muttered their thin song, too thin today, while a black sheen had taken some of the leaves, not the whole plant, but enough to make the heart lurch. It was frostburn, the kind that looks like wet silk and then turns to ash under a finger. "We'll save what we can," Rory said at once, because the room needed a sentence that didn't break. "Breathe slow. We'll be the warm thing." He added, and that memory steadied her, counting, steam rising, a night they had bent the cold back by inches. She moved, hands already knowing the rights. Lift the cloche a finger's breadth, lay the burlap like a roof, slide pans of warmed water under the bench, build a straw wall to keep the heat where the living still held it. She did not cry. She wiped milk-white bloom from the inside of glass with the heel of her glove and did not cry. "How?" she asked at last, when rhythm made her voice possible. "We set them right." Rory's glance went to the high vent and back. "These were open wider than I left them," he said, low. "More than the night needs, even if you mean to err." He touched the hinge, then held up the short length of twine that should have kept the sash at a thumb's breadth. The end was clean, not frayed. "The wind doesn't cut," Mr. Pritchard said, and his voice had in it a weariness older than his limp. "It takes, it tears, that's a knife." He straightened with care and then, astonishingly, said, "And I did it." He spoke loud enough for any ear at the door. "I forgot myself. I thought the air too close. I drew them a notch and meant to close again and—" His mouth flattened. "I slept." "No," Elizabeth said at once and with more certainty than she felt. "You don't." "I do," he returned, that stubborn kindness men use when they are shielding someone they think worth the bruise. "I've hands. They fail. I'll answer for it." Rory's jaw set hard, but he said only, "We work, then we count the loss." He lifted a ruined leaf with too much gentleness and let it fall. "The quick cuttings, some will hold." He shifted the cloche over the strongest, his body between Elizabeth and the worst of it, as if his back were glass. They worked until thought shrank to tasks. Heat rose. The black gloss did not spread further. Where it had bitten first, it had done what it had come to do. Elizabeth's breath came even again, but something cold had set in behind her ribs that warmth could not entirely reach. Mr. Boyd arrived with the habit of a man who always appears when numbers falter. He stood just inside the door and kept his coat on, as if the chill were someone else's fault. His eyes moved from leaf to vent to twine. He said nothing for a full 20 seconds, then, "Unfortunate." "We're keeping it," Rory answered, voice steady as planks underfoot. "We'll lift the worst and start again this afternoon." Mr. Boyd's brow tipped toward Mr. Pritchard. "Negligence, is it?" "My doing," Mr. Pritchard said, neither bowing nor blustering. "I'll take the docked pay and the dressing down." "No one is docking anyone," Elizabeth said. She didn't raise her voice. She set it squarely on the floor between them. "We've a market to supply and a scheme that is working. We'll salvage. We'll sow again. We'll not spend the morning apportioning blame when heat is what saves." Mr. Boyd inclined his head the precise inch required. "As you wish, my lady." He looked at the cut twine again, and there was a flicker, gone too quickly to name. "I shall inform the Laird." He turned and left without offering a hand. When the door had shut, Rory let out the smallest breath. He lifted the severed twine as if it were evidence he hated to touch. "We'll knot it for now," he said, practical because there was no other safe ground. "And we'll keep the high vents pegged from inside with the old copper nails. Wind answers to no man, nor does malice." The word slid into the air like a blade into a sheath. It fit. By noon, the worst was past. The living had been defended, the lost counted with quiet hands. Elizabeth stood with fingers wrapped around a mug Mrs. Drummond had pressed on her, broth hot enough to argue, and felt the tiredness fill her limbs. "The cottages," she said suddenly. "Blankets." The thought presented itself whole, as if stamped on brown paper. If the night had stolen heat here, it had stolen it harder from the thin walls at the edge of the yard. Nellie and two of the younger maids were already rolling flannel like soldiers' coats when Elizabeth reached the kitchen. "Mrs. D said," Nellie told her, eyes fierce with purpose, "says we've more than we need, and they've less than is decent." They went out together, a procession of arms full of warmth. The first cottage took its blanket with a half-laughing scold that called Elizabeth daft and then blessed in the same breath. At the third, the latch stuck, then gave, and a woman in a dark dress opened to them, broad-hipped, clean, hair tucked under a cotton cap, eyes like the kind of blue Scotland keeps for sharp mornings. "You'll be Lady Elizabeth," she said, and it was not a question. The room smelled of peat and soap. "I'm Mrs. MacRae. Rory's lodging with me and my old man till he remembers to find a wife to scold him proper." Elizabeth laughed despite the day. "Then I thank you for the scolding in the meantime." She held out the folded blanket. "A cold night." "A hungry one, if you've no coal," Mrs. MacRae said, taking the blanket and then, without fuss, setting it back into Elizabeth's hands. "I've two. Take this to the widow Kerr at the end. She's proud and she's daft and she won't ask." She peered at Elizabeth's fingertips, at the faint green stain that never seemed to wash completely away now. "You've good hands," she said so simply that Elizabeth nearly cried. "Plants know. Folk do too. Keep them soft as long as you can. The world roughens soon enough." "I'll try," Elizabeth managed. "Do," Mrs. MacRae said. "And tell that boy he's to eat more. He comes in smelling of earth and work and thinks soup is a meal. Soup is a beginning." They laughed together like women who had known each other longer than a minute. Elizabeth left lighter than she had come, and carried the blanket to the last cottage, where a thin kettle rattled on a mean fire, and a woman with white plates insisted she would manage, and then cried without sound when Elizabeth set the flannel across her lap. When Elizabeth returned to the glasshouse near dusk, the worst black had dulled to brown along the edges of leaves. New pans steamed. The straw wall held its heat like a secret. Rory stood with his palm above the quick cutting they had marked days ago. He did not touch it. "It's kept," he said, relief making a quieter man of him even than usual. "Some of the seedlings will sulk. We'll sow again." "Someone cut the twine," Elizabeth said, because the cottages had made her brave in ordinary ways. "Do you think?" "I think we'll peg the vents and keep our own counsel," he answered, "and work where we know what grows." "Mr. Pritchard shouldn't take the blame," she said. "He chooses it," Rory returned, and his eyes were tender and furious in the same narrow space. "Some men stand where a blow is going to fall because they've the back for it. Don't think he has no pride. He's choosing who he is." She nodded because she suddenly understood that, too, the choosing. They stood a long minute, listening to the little worlds under glass relearn their heat. Outside, evening made lace of the bare branches. Inside, the scent of lemon leaf and damp loam insisted on staying. "Tomorrow," Elizabeth said. "Tomorrow," Rory answered. "We try back." She slipped her hand briefly against the bench where his had rested, as if to borrow the shape of that steadiness. The night had carried frost and a knife and a lie told to shield the truth. It had left also a blessing from a woman with soap on her hands, a widow with a warm lap, and a living root under glass. It was not nothing. It was enough to open the door and step out into cold that would own her. Chapter 11. The Library Without Candles. The library wore its thrift honestly. No candles wasted for comfort. Only the fire laid low and the winter light that seeped through the tall panes like watered milk. Dust hung in the stillness the way old stories do when no one is speaking them aloud. Elizabeth paused at the threshold and felt the quiet note of the room settle in her chest. Her father stood by the long table with a ledger shut under his palm, as if numbers could be kept quiet by touch. He looked toward her, and the line of his mouth eased. "You've earth on your cuff," Alastair said. "Your mother would have kissed you for that." Elizabeth brushed at the faint green and didn't try very hard to remove it. "We held the worst," she said. "Some cuttings sulked, the strong kept. She didn't add someone cut the vent twine. The truth was too sharp to place on this table." He nodded. "I heard you went to the cottages." "Mrs. MacVee sent me on with a blanket," Elizabeth said, and smiled at the memory. "She scolds with love. It feels like being put back into your right shape." Alastair's gaze drifted to the far case where a row of botany books leaned together, spines rubbed soft by years of hands. He crossed to it and took one down, not the most handsome, only the most used. When he opened it, a pressed petal fell, the ghost of a colour that had once been bold. He set it on the table between them, the way a man puts down a keepsake he has carried too long in his pocket. "Your mother's marks," he said, touching the pencil ticks in the margins. She argued with the author in pencil when she thought him wrong. Sometimes she was kind and wrote perhaps. Sometimes she wrote no, as if she were keeping a gate. His thumb rested on a small note in that brisk, leaning hand. "Heat and patience are cousins. Treat them alike." Elizabeth swallowed. "I've used her shawl in the glasshouse." "I saw," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted. She would have approved. She liked usefulness better than reverence. He shut the book and left his hand over it. "I have tried to be both." The fire settled, a faint shift of red. Beyond the window, frost made lace of the ivy that climbed the stone. Elizabeth wanted to say, "We are close," but close does not pay a note at Whitsunday, and hope does not mend a cracked pane unless someone also brings glass. Alastair did not sit. He never did when he had too much to say. "Mr. Boyd brings me ledgers that read like weather," he said. "Blackwood brings me terms that read like rescue." He looked up, the honesty of it unflinching. "I am afraid, Elizabeth. I do not mind the word. I am afraid of selling the place your mother walked. I am afraid of keeping it at the price of something that should not be priced." Her throat ached at the gentleness there. "I am afraid too," she said, "but not of trying." He gave a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had been younger. "Then tell me what trying is, and tell me plainly." She did, because the room asked for plainness. "Double the hotbeds this week, 4 frames, not 2. We can do it. The boys from McFarlane's will trade dung for coal and gossip. Sow quick things every 3 days, so there's always something to cut. Put primulas in the windows of the baker and the seamstress and the inn. Aunt Morag will arrange it so people think it was their idea. Send Crest to the vicarage kitchen and let the curate be seen carrying it home." She drew breath. "Offer small kitchen baskets to 3 houses with ready coin. The doctor, the lawyer, Mrs. Stenhouse with her teas. Delivered Saturdays with your note. We'll stamp the paper with the winter rose. People like to belong to a thing." He listened. He did not look away to the ledger or the fire. The only movement was his hand, turning the pressed petal once on the table, as if weighing its little history. "And glass?" he asked. "Rory can mend more than we thought," Elizabeth said, careful to keep her voice even on his name. "He's learned to patch with oiled paper and wire for now. Later, if we can, he'll fire small panes at MacFarlane's kiln after hours." She hesitated, then added, because she would not hide the truth that did not harm. "He is very good at what he does, father." "I have eyes," Alastair said, not unkind, "and ears enough to hear the house speak when people believe it's silent." Heat rose in Elizabeth's face. She looked down at her hands, clean but not the way ladies' hands are expected to be, and let the shame pass through without stopping. "I mean to keep the glasshouse alive," she said. "I mean to keep the estate from being parcelled. If Blackwood's help is needed after we have tried this, I will not be childish, but I will not be hurried into being useful in the way that costs me most." Alastair moved around the table and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the wool of his coat and the tired strength under it. He put his hand over hers, the same size as when she was small, somehow, the same weight of safety. "I will not sell you," he said, "not to a balance sheet, not to a clever man with clean gloves." He looked toward the window, and his voice went softer, as if he were answering the past as well as the present. "Your mother married me when the roof leaked and the books were a mess, and I had only a good name and a bad map. She fixed the map. I would have liked to give her ease. I gave her love and land instead." He turned back. "I am trying to give you both." She couldn't speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was thin as the paper between the pages. "Give me time," she said. "Give me a fortnight to show the market what hope looks like in a paper wrapper. Easter is a long way and a very short one. Let me walk the long way." He considered as he always did, not because he doubted her, but because he refused to make any choice without looking at it from all sides until it stopped pretending to be simple. Then he nodded once, like a judge ruling in favour of a truth he'd hoped to hear. "A fortnight," he said, "4 frames by week's end, baskets on Saturday. I will write the lawyer and the doctor myself. I will even let Morag put flowers in windows if she'll promise not to rearrange the town council while she's about it." "She can't promise that," Elizabeth said, and their smiles matched for a breath. He opened a drawer and drew out a small leather case. Inside lay a pencil with a brass tip and a scar on the wood where someone had sharpened too hard in haste. "Your mother's," he said. "She kept it in her pocket to mark what mattered. Use it. Argue with the books in pencil. Keep a gate when you must." Elizabeth took it as if it might bruise. It was light, and it weighed everything. "I will." They stood a moment longer, the quiet doing what it does when it is allowed, knitting a room back around the people in it. Outside, the frost began to lift from the ivy, dripping like a clock no one had wound. The library smelled of old paper and a little of earth. Elizabeth realized it clung to her and did not mind. At the door, Alastair said, as if he had only just remembered to put the thought into air, "What do you want, Elizabeth? Not for the house, for you." She held the pencil and knew at once that she could finally answer at least part of that question without flinching. "To choose my work," she said. "To be of use and not be used. To be kind and brave, in that order if I can." She hesitated, then added, softer, "To be loved the way work can be, a thing done daily and with care." He bent and kissed her hair, which had refused to stay as the dressmaker pinned it. "Then we will ask the world for exactly that," he said. "And we will hold fast if it offers less." When she left him, the corridor felt wider than it had. She tucked the pencil into the secret pocket under her skirt, beside the paper with Rory's stamped rose. "Heat and patience are cousins," her mother had written. "Treat them alike." She went down to the glasshouse, where both were waiting to be used. Chapter 12. Terms of a Baron. By noon the yard had a good, honest clatter to it. Boys from McFarlane's brought dung like treasure. Mr. Pritchard sorted sash wood with the solemnity of a priest. Rory set his palm to the hotbeds and read their warmth as if taking the estate's pulse. Elizabeth moved between them with a ledger under her arm and her mother's pencil in her pocket, the little winter rose stamp still faint on the ball of her thumb. "Baskets on Saturday," she told Aunt Morag, who had appeared with a sheaf of envelopes and the air of a woman about to rearrange a parish. "Doctor, lawyer, Mrs. Stenhouse, a note from father tucked beneath the cress." "Done," Aunt Morag said, and licked a stamp. "We'll make it seem their idea. People love their own good sense." A carriage turned in at the gate before the lamps were lit, bright paint against the cold day. Blackwood stepped down with his hat brim shadowing a smile made for halls and committees. "Lady Elizabeth, Miss Morag, Laird MacRae within?" he asked the air as if the house itself would answer. It did, obliging. Alastair met them in the study with the ledger shut and his shoulders square. Blackwood laid out papers as a fisherman lays his catch. Neat, gleaming, shock not permitted. A clean note to sweep the arrears. he said, tapping cream with his forefinger. A reasonable instrument to replace the bank's poor one. And, the briefest pause, a date the town can pin its hopes to. Which date? Alistair asked, though Elizabeth already knew what was coming. Easter had been sitting like a bright stone in every conversation for a week. Easter Monday, Blackwood said. An announcement after the service when goodwill is full and tongues are occupied with hymn tunes. His smile turned itself to Elizabeth. Then a June wedding, handsome, seasonable, decent. I'll make a gift to the poor box. People take to generosity if it has a bell on it. Aunt Morag coughed. People take to roofs that do not leak. Which this accomplishes, he returned, unruffled. Security is a good roof. Elizabeth's father ran his thumb over the buttonhole, rose the way a man feels for a bead on a rosary. We'll read, he said. We'll answer, not decide. Of course, Blackwood said, and made it sound like patience. When the talk slid to numbers that did not need her ears, Elizabeth stepped to the corridor for air. Blackwood followed as if the corridor were a drawing room no one had remembered to furnish. "May I?" he asked, and did not wait for permission. They stood near the tall window where frost made a fern of the glass. He seemed to enjoy speaking softly to walls. "I'll be plain," he said, hands gentle on his gloves as if praising them for their service. "Easter is water to a fire. It will douse talk." His gaze flicked briefly toward her wrist, the green half-moon stains gardening leaves, then back to her face. "It will change the story of you from girl in a glasshouse at midnight to lady with a future. I don't say this to scold. I say it because I know towns and their tidy mouths. I do not need a future to be put upon me like a shawl," Elizabeth said even. "No," he agreed, "but I can keep the wind off while you choose which way to walk." He took a breath and turned the charm of fraction down, the way one eases a flame so as not to scorch. "There's another matter, not a pleasant one. I'll spare you the rough version and give you the soft." "I prefer the true," Elizabeth said. "The true is this," he replied. "The head gardener's apprentice is a distraction. To you, to others." He held up a hand before she could speak. "I'm not a jealous man. I'm a man who knows arithmetic. Reputation plus rumour minus time equals trouble. I will not have your name in other people's mouths in a key I do not choose." His eyes stayed polite, which made the blade cleaner. "Mr. Kincaid will be relocated, kindly, with a character that helps him onward. Mr. Boyd will see to it, as is proper." Elizabeth felt the wall at her back. She had the oddest thought, that if she set her hand on the frost she would leave the ghost of a rose there. "Rory is indispensable," she said, and the use of his given name in that hall shocked her ear. "To the work, to the glasshouse." "He is not indispensable to you," Blackwood said almost gently, "nor to your father's name, nor to my plans. Let me take this thorn from your heel and you will walk the straighter for it. Easter is cleanest without a shadow." "I have not agreed to anything," Elizabeth said, and heard how soft that sounded against a man made of decisions. "You haven't refused either." He did not step closer, and yet she felt him narrowing the air all the same. "I take your silence for care, for your father, for the estate. I'm impressed by it." He inclined his head. "Say the word, and I'll delay, but I won't pretend delay makes anything easier." Elizabeth thought of hotbeds breathing like animals, of a potato stamp drying on brown paper, of Mrs. MacRae saying, "Keep your hands soft as long as you can," of a root under glass that meant to live. She thought of her father's face in the library when he had said, "I will not sell you," and how fear had sat there anyway and called itself prudence. She could have said no. The word was there. It had weight. It would have struck the floor and sounded like a bell. She let it sit in her mouth and did not place it. Blackwood watched nothing change and accepted it. "I will speak with Mr. Boyd," he said, as if fetching a coat. "The rest you needn't trouble yourself with. We'll have civility and good order before Easter. The town likes a neat table." He inclined his head, and somehow the bow managed to be grateful and proprietary at once. When he went back into the study, Elizabeth's hand found the cold of the pane. Her breath made a small cloud. She wrote no in it with her fingertip, and watched the word vanish as if it had never been. She walked to the glasshouse because there was nothing else she could do that would not betray her. The lemon geranium offered its clean handkerchief. The hotbeds breathed. Rory had a length of copper nail between his teeth and the vent propped with a certainty malice could not lift. "How fares the house?" he asked without turning. "Full of paper," she said, "and weather forecasts." He set the nail, tested it, took it out, set it again. "Then we'll have to make our own forecast." "Rory," she said, and the way his name came out told them both what she had not said in the corridor. He turned then slowly, as if not to startle a hurt thing. "What is it?" he asked. She almost told him everything. The Easter bell he meant to ring for her, the clean note meant to pay, the neat way a man can erase a life that doesn't fit his column. She almost gave him the mercy of warning. "Aye," she began, and her throat closed on the truth. She looked at the quick cutting instead, the one they had named, root like a pale fist, leaf like a promise. "Mr. Boyd is particular," she said, and hated herself for the smallness of it. About lines, about what's seen. Rory read the rest. He always did. He nodded once, as if she had asked him to lift a barrow instead of a life. "Aye," he said, "he is." They stood with a bench between them, each with a hand on the same strip of wood, skin not touching. She wanted to lift her hand so his could lie there. She left it where it was because she had already left too much unsaid. "We'll set another frame this afternoon," he said after a time, practical as a coat. "If the dung comes warm." "It will," she said, and heard how many things the sentence tried to cover. At dusk she crossed the yard with a basket of stamped papers and the smell of earth in her hair. In the study, Aunt Morag's pen scratched like a thin saw. Alastair stood at the window with his hand on the pane as if feeling for a weather no one could name. Down the corridor, Mr. Boyd's voice came low and polite behind a half-shut door. Another, smoother voice answered. The words did not carry. The meaning did. Elizabeth kept walking, because sometimes that is all a person can do when a choice has been taken from their mouth and placed in their silence. Under glass, the quick cutting held. Above it, the evening pressed its face to the pane and wrote nothing. Chapter 13. The Apprentice Dismissed. They were pricking out seedlings when the day changed its key. Rory had set the tray between them and drawn lines in the soil with the side of his hand, straight, shallow, kind. Elizabeth teased up a clump of cress with the dibber he'd whittled from ash, easing each thread-fine root free as if lifting words from a page without tearing. The hotbeds breathed. The lemon geranium held its little handkerchief ready. Mr. Pritchard hummed somewhere near the vents, the tune old and tuneless as rope, boots on the path, not the gardener's tread, not a boy's run with gossip or dung, a measured heel, a book closing. Mr. Boyd filled the doorway with his ledger held like a hymnal, and his mouth set as if he were about to sing something correct. Behind him stood the under-steward with a wrapped parcel and a face that learned not to feel things on duty. "Mr. Kincaid," Mr. Boyd said, voice dry as salt, "if you'll step outside a moment." Rory set the dibber down and wiped his hands on the apron tied over his coat. He didn't look at Elizabeth, and somehow that was worse. Mr. Pritchard stumped to the aisle, jaw already lifting, eyes lit with the tired fire of a man who has argued with weather and fools and expects to win only half the time. "Whatever it is," Mr. Pritchard said, "say it where the plants can hear. They're the only ones with sense in January." "February," Elizabeth said, because accuracy was a handhold. "Quite," Mr. Boyd returned, unmoved. He stepped just inside to keep the wind from the beds, a courtesy that made the rest of him seem colder. "It has been decided, upon consideration of recent negligence," he did not look at the cut, clean twine, he did not need to, "that your services are no longer required. Wages in lieu of notice will be issued. Your character shall be furnished on application to the office." The words sat on the warm air like sleet. "No," Mr. Pritchard said, not shouting, which made it sound larger. "My doing," I said. "Put it on me. The estate cannot dismiss its head gardener in the middle of winter without causing alarm," Mr. Boyd answered, soft as pins. "Nor can it retain a man who allows carelessness to put the house at hazard." "It was a knife," Mr. Pritchard said, and his bandaged finger trembled with the effort of not pointing. "If you must sack a blade, take it to the blacksmith." "Enough." Boyd's gaze flicked once toward Elizabeth, respectful and warning. "My lady." Elizabeth tasted the iron of anger and the salt of fear. "My father did not sign this," she said, because the air in the room needed a fact. "The Laird has delegated matters of staff to my office," Mr. Boyd said smoothly. "He is made aware as required." His glance slid, almost lazily, to the small winter rose stamped on the paper wrapper tied to a seed box, as if noting a trifle. "We must all keep to our proper work." Rory had not moved. He looked at the beds as a seaman looks at sea when the order comes to go ashore. "I'll not quarrel," he said, and the steadiness of it put heat into Elizabeth's eyes. He untied the apron, folded it, set it on the bench, and wiped his palms once more, though there was no soil left to lose. "Mr. Pritchard, I'll put your tools where you can find them and wedge the east sash. It's been sulking 2 days." "You'll do no such thing," Mr. Pritchard growled. "You'll leave it for me and take your coat, and you'll walk out with your head on, and if I catch you with your back bent, I'll tan it myself." Rory's mouth tipped at that. Not quite a smile, not. He turned to Elizabeth then at last, and the room balanced on that small, ordinary movement. "My lady," he said. "Rory," she answered, and heard her voice shape the plea she would not make in front of Mr. Boyd. She wanted to say stay. She wanted to say I did not. She wanted to lay every truth in the aisle like planks and walk him back from the door across them. Her hands did the only safe thing. She reached for a cloche and lifted it the proper finger's breadth, as if tending could hold a man the way it held heat. He nodded once, gratitude or farewell in the motion, and took the parcel from the understeward. His tool roll, wrapped in sacking, the careful weight of a life's worth of small precisions. He did not look around the house to find something of his to miss. He had never let himself leave pieces that would make going harder. "I'll send for the rest from Mrs. MacRae's," he said to Mr. Pritchard, and then, to Elizabeth, "You'll lift the frames at midday. The heat will spike." "I know," she said, which was the wrong tense and the only one she could manage. He walked out with nothing of a man thrown. The understeward went after, because rules can always find a man a door to fit them. Mr. Boyd lingered the half-breath required by politeness and then drew the door to, not slamming, not soft. The lemon leaf felt suddenly too clean. Mr. Pritchard made a noise that was not a word. He took one step after Rory and then stopped with his hand braced against the frame, head bowed. For a moment he looked very old. Then he hauled himself upright and turned on Elizabeth as if she were a wall strong enough to take it. "Go," he said, not unkind. "You'll not be seen begging a man back in his own house. Go upstairs and make a noise with paper Mr. Boyd can hear from his desk. Let me have my temper here where it will not cost you." Elizabeth's throat closed on both apology and rage. She set the cloche back with hands that did not quite tremble and walked to the door like a woman who had to learn her legs again. In the corridor the cold bit so sharp she understood why people put furs to their lips. Mrs. Drummond waited in the side hall, expression arranged like good linen. "I know," the housekeeper said, before Elizabeth could speak. "He came by the kitchen on the way men do who were raised right, thanked me for the broth and the bread and the scolding, said he'd leave the key to the potting shed on the hook by the door." Elizabeth's breath hitched. "Can it be undone?" Mrs. Drummond's face did a small, fierce thing. "I've seen dismissals undone and marriages, and I'll tell you which costs more to mend. Go to your father. Tell him now while the ink is still wet." Elizabeth ran. She threw propriety to the stone floor and let it lie. The study door stood open. The chair was empty. The ledger lay with a page marked by the brass clip. No Alistair. No Aunt Morag. Only the smell of ash and paper and the rose stem he had left in the glass, as if he meant to be back in a moment. "Where?" she began, and the butler, passing, said, "To the steward's office, my lady," with the quiet of a man who had carried messages between rooms his whole life and hated some more than others. She turned that way. Voices carried from behind the half-closed door, Mr. Boyd's tidy tone and another, smoother, ironed of feeling. Blackwood, of course. The air in the corridor seemed to flatten, as if even the draught had been taught to behave. Elizabeth stopped. If she went in with her face hot and her heart running, they would call it girlish. If she went in with her voice steady, they would call it cold. Either way, the thing would already be done and named. She stood there a beat too long and missed him. From the east landing, a line of window looked over the yard. She climbed the steps because there was nothing else between her and the folly of storming men with paper shields. She put her hand to the cold glass and found him with her eyes the way a person finds their place in a book by feel. Rory crossed the yard with his parcel under his arm and his cap set straight. He did not glance back. "Mr." Pritchard limped to the threshold, hat crushed in his fist, and did not call. Men who had worked under other roofs straightened as he passed, the way iron filings lift when a magnet moves through them. Someone, Nellie, reckless dear, stepped from the kitchen path with a loaf wrapped in a tea towel and thrust it into his hands without asking. He took it, awkward as a rich man given a child's drawing, and said something that made her wipe her cheek with her sleeve and blush. The yard gate opened. The road took him. The space he left closed like water does, slow to show the disturbance, slow to forget. Elizabeth's palm left a mist on the pane, a cloud shaped to a hand and then gone. She did not cry. The tears would have been a leak, and leaks ruin houses if you let them. She stood until the last edge of his coat turned the corner, and then until there was nothing left to see but her own face reflected in the glass, pale and stubborn and not finished. Behind her a clock struck the half. Downstairs paper moved across paper with a sound like frost passing underfoot. In the glasshouse the pipes hummed their low animal song, and the quick-cutting, uncurling root to soil did not know that the hand that had set it would not return at dawn. Elizabeth set her hand flat to the cold and told herself the truth. Mrs. MacRae had given her with a blanket. Keep your hands soft as long as you can. The world roughens soon enough. She would write later and not send it. She would walk to the glasshouse because breath lives there. She would stand in the aisle Mr. Boyd had not measured yet and choose what could be chosen, to keep the frames warm, to keep the name, to keep the work. For now she stood and watched nothing and laid her palm to the pane, as if the glass could carry warmth to where he had gone. Chapter 14. Letters Never Sent. The first letter began with a lie. "Dear Rory, I am well." Elizabeth stared at the words until they blurred, then struck a line through well with her mother's brass-tipped pencil. The library fire had been coaxed to a sensible burn. Still the room felt colder than rooms do when you are the only person in them. On the table lay the pressed petal her father had turned in his fingers the day before, pale as old porcelain. In the secret pocket under her skirt, the scrap with the little stamped rose warmed where it touched her. She began again. "You left with your cap straight, and I did not say the right thing. I said nothing at all, which feels like a smaller wrong only if you are not the person carrying it." She stopped, hearing the sentence sound like someone else, someone braver on paper than in halls. She folded the page once, then tore it not quite neatly and fed it to the grate. The ash took it with a sigh, like a promise too thin to keep. The second letter started without greeting. "Mr. Boyd is wrong." She wrote it and felt the heat rush to her face as if the paper could blush for her. She set the pencil down, picked it up, added, softer, "He is not the only one who knows arithmetic. I can count what would be lost and what might be kept, and the numbers do not come out clean." That one she folded and did not burn. She slid it into the book of botany where her mother had written no in the margin and left it there with the pressed petal to weigh it down. Work, which had saved worse mornings, did not take everything out of this one. Still, it took enough. Elizabeth carried stamped papers and tied string until her fingers remembered why they existed. She walked to the kitchen with a list and returned with baskets. Cress crisp as new thinking, mustard with its pepper promise, a primula pale as the inside of a shell. She tucked her father's notes under the cloth, with compliments of the MacRae kitchen, Saturday deliveries henceforth, and went into town with Aunt Morag, who could part a market with the tilt of a chin. At the doctor's, the maid took the basket and the news in equal measure. At the lawyer's, the clerk wrote subscription in his book, as if it had been his idea all along. Mrs. Stenhouse, who ran teas like a general runs a campaign, stood in her doorway with flour on her sleeve and declared that her windows had been too blue all winter, and she would have 3 primulas for the front room and 1 for herself, because kitchens deserve flowers more than parlours. Coins kissed tins. The little rose stamp did its work. Something to touch, something to say. "Winter rose," people repeated, and liked the taste. And yet, walking back along the lane, Elizabeth felt the absence walk with her. It kept her company like a polite stranger. Mrs. Drummond met her at the side door with a napkin-wrapped slice of oat cake. A person might pretend had been left over and had not been made because someone saw what could not be fed with soup. "Eat," the housekeeper said. "It puts steadiness back where it runs out." "I wrote," Elizabeth said, unexpected, almost apologising. "Good." Mrs. Drummond wiped a non-existent flower from the table. "Send?" "No." "Good," she said again. "Wait to decide a thing until after your tea. Otherwise you let hunger make your choices, and it has no sense at all." Downshore, the sea ran its thumb along the coast and came back with salt under it. The nursery there sat behind a windbreak of scrub pines, and a fence mended more often than it broke. Rory learned the owner's temper in an hour, and the furnace in a day. Mr. Gillies was a man who had given most of his words to the elements and kept only the ones that held. He showed Rory the little kiln in a shed that had once been a cow byre, where panes could be fired to size if a person knew how to read heat as well as men read accounts. "You've a careful hand," Gillies said, watching him float glass into the frame with a patience that ignored the cold. "I've had practice," Rory answered. "You'll have more." The sea made its own weather. Rory woke to it, worked to it, slept with it, muttering at the wall. He mended sash, learned the kiln's temper, stamped a crate out of habit with a mark it did not know, and then rubbed the black off his thumb as if it had been a mistake. On his first Sunday he walked to the station and stood under the timetable until the numbers meant names again. A man behind the wicket chewed a pencil and said, "Where to, then?" as if every question had an answer with a price. "MacRae Holt," Rory said, mouth dry. The clerk wrote it on a stiff rectangle and slid it under the rail. Rory took it, felt the sharp edge bite his palm, folded it once, then once more until the word disappeared into the paper's muscle. He put it in his coat and did not hand it back with coin. "Another day," he said, to the man or to himself, and turned toward the water until the impulse quieted. At MacRae, the hotbeds held like animals sleeping in pairs. Elizabeth lifted the frames at noon and let the rush of warm air kiss her face. She thinned seedlings with a brutal kindness she was proud to own. Leave the strong, let the weak go to feed the others. She understood suddenly why this hurt and why it mattered that it did. In the evening she took out the second letter and read the sentence that had sounded dangerous at noon and now sounded true. She added a third line, as if the day had given her a phrasing she could bear. "The thing I cannot seem to write is not for paper. It is for work and for breath." She put the letter back between the pages and closed the book. Later she lit a taper and wrote one more, the shortest of them all. "You kept the roses breathing. I am trying to do the same." She did not sign it. She folded it into the little muslin pocket she had stamped with the rose, the one she used to carry pins for tying paper. She told herself she would post it when the baskets went out again. She did not. News travelled as it always does, through kitchens, between stalls, along fences. By Thursday a woman buying a cabbage told Nellie that Lady Elizabeth would be engaged by Easter. By Friday, the curate's wife told Aunt Morag that she would be disappointed if the banns were not read soon, because it's nice when people do the expected thing at the expected time. It keeps the weather calm. Aunt Morag smiled and arranged primulas in the vicarage windows in such a way that the curate's study looked for a moment like spring had chosen it first. That night, Elizabeth walked to the glasshouse in a dress she had not changed out of, her hair pinned the way the dressmaker had prescribed. She set her palm over the quick cutting and felt the whisper of heat it had made for itself. "Live," she said, to the plant or to the part of her that had been cut clean and told to root. Beyond the yard, the road ran down to the station. A man there took a folded ticket out of his pocket and unfolded it until the name showed again. He laid it on the ledge and weighed it with a coin he did not push forward. He stood like that a long minute, then put both back into his coat, the way people do when they choose to carry what they cannot yet use. In the library, the pressed petal did what pressed things do. It kept its colour as best it could, and remembered the hand that had given it weight. Elizabeth closed the drawer on her mother's pencil and went to bed with the feeling of paper never sent under her ribs, light as ash and heavy as a secret. Chapter 15. A house dressed in roses. By June the house had learned a new breath. Windows stood wide. Bees found their way in and out as if doors were a suggestion. Baskets went down to town each Saturday, stamped with the little winter rose, and coin came back up the hill with the steadiness of a clock that had been wound at last. Midsummer meant the fete. Tents on the east lawn, a bandstand borrowed from the village green, ladies' tables smoothed with linen furs. Aunt Morag had bullied out of cupboards that claimed to be empty. Mr. Boyd walked the routes with a string and a neat eye, measuring distances as if politeness had feet. He had a list titled Floral Display under his arm. Abundance, he said, tapping it. People like to see what they imagine they already own. People like shade and lemonade, Aunt Morag returned, crisp as pastry. Abundance will wilt if you bully it. Baron Blackwood sent a note in a hand that made even the envelopes look obedient. A handsome display is essential. The announcement will be better received in an air of prosperity. He underlined essential once, then did not have to. He arrived that afternoon to stand with Alistair on the terrace and sketch with his finger where things would go as if the lawn were paper. An arch here, he said, and garlands along the steps. A table of blooms at the hall door for guests to admire as they pass. I'll send up roses from my hothouse, tea varieties the town will recognise from the London prints. Send, Aunt Morag said, and when he turned, her smile was one that had sent bishops back to their chairs. We'll give them a Scottish summer without London telling it how to behave. Elizabeth said nothing. She stood with a list of names for workers and a pencil in her pocket that had belonged to her mother and felt the day move around her like a tide. When the talk turned to music, she walked off under the pretext of fetching a measure and did not come back until voices had changed rooms. In the glasshouse, the heat was a soft weight, not a scold. Mr. Pritchard had set the vents just so, copper pegs bright in the light. The hotbeds breathed low and even. Along the back bench, the cuttings that had refused to die held their green like a promise. The quick one, the one she and Rory had marked first, sat in its pot with a quiet pride, leaves sound, stem thickening where life quietly adds itself. Nearly there, Mr. Pritchard said, limping down the aisle with a coil of twine. Another fortnight, and we'll let the strong ones think about their own pots. Not before the fete, Elizabeth said. Not before, he agreed. He eyed her face and the way worry set along her jaw. They'll want flowers for the arch. We've the locals. MacFarlane's wife grows a hedge any bride would steal. Blackwood's tea roses will preen too much but hold through the afternoon if we shade their feet. We can make a show without lying. Elizabeth exhaled. We'll dress the house, she said, but it will wear its own name. Mrs. Drummond came in with a small parcel and a look that had been polished to calm. This was found at the back of the potting bench, she said, as if she were returning a lost glove. Put aside during the winter nonsense and not noticed, which is my fault. She placed it on the staging and set her hand briefly over Elizabeth's wrist, as if to steady a jar. String, brown paper, the neatness of a man who knows a thing might be carried. Elizabeth worked the knot loose with her thumbnail. Inside lay a few stiff scraps and a single folded sheet. She knew the first line before she opened it. The rose he'd sketched in pencil, 5 petals, tight heart, 2 leaves, a small dark undershadow at the base sat cleaner now, refined from the potato's bluntness, as if he'd meant it to last. Below it he'd written the words in a hand that kept itself small. Cut clean, set steady, leave air enough to breathe. Heat rose in her throat. Not tears, something like air finding its way past something tight. She took the sketch to the light and felt the room narrow to the width of her palm. Mr. Pritchard cleared his throat as if soot had chosen that moment to be difficult. We'll need cards for the table labels, he said to no one in particular. Stamps won't cut themselves. I'll cut it, Elizabeth said, and surprised herself with how quickly the decision stood up. Not a potato, a block, proper. She touched the pencil line with the ball of her thumb, came away grey. We'll mark everything we bring from here. People will carry it home and see it on the ribbon when they wash the glass. They'll remember this house by more than arches. Mr. Pritchard's eyes warmed the way coals do when a bellows whispers. Aye. She took the sketch to Aunt Morag, who looked at it without making the face people make when looking at sentiment. Good, her aunt said. We'll tie it to napkins and to lemonade jars and to the children who get lost so we can return them with style." She held the paper up to the window and then down to the table. "Can you cut straight?" "I can learn," Elizabeth said. "Then you shall." Aunt Morag nodded once. "You're your mother's child. She told the world what a thing was called and then made it behave." Blackwood's roses arrived the next day in crates packed with damp moss and a sheet that listed the names as if they were guests of rank. Lady Hillingdon, Madame Plantier, Gloire de Dijon. They were handsome. They smelled like a room that took its tea with sugar and didn't know the price of coal. Elizabeth stood the crates in the north shade and watered from the rain butt, not the pump, the way Mr. Pritchard would have done if he trusted the moss. She built their arch with Mr. Pritchard's steadier hands and the younger men's shoulders, not too much, not too tight. Roses went up, local hedge blooms tucked in, greenery threaded like quiet music. It looked like plenty without shouting. In the hall, Mrs. Drummond oversaw a long table the length of a pew, white cloth, jars ready. Elizabeth brought a stack of cards she had cut from old ledger backs and the block she had carved overnight. The knife had blunted once. Her thumb held a thin plaster where it had reminded her to be careful. The stamp came down clean, then again, then again. Winter rose, ink drying to a soft, good black. Nellie tied them with string to narrow necks, the knot the same quick one Rory had always made. Alastair came to the doorway and watched without putting his hands in it. His eyes were bright, the way people's eyes get when they've decided to let something good happen without stopping it to check the arithmetic. "The town will talk," he said. "Let them," Aunt Morag replied. "They've not had much else to put in their mouths this year." Blackwood appeared near evening, as men do who prefer to see the thing finished to the sight of it being made. He walked the length of the table and touched one stamped card with a finger. "A sign," he said. "Clever." "It is ours," Elizabeth said even. "Of course," he returned, and his smile did the exact thing smiles do when they acknowledge a small rebellion and put it aside as charming rather than costly. "The arch is correct. The steps are handsome. The town will approve." "The town will eat and go home," Aunt Morag said. "Approval is a hobby. Work is dinner." He laughed once, perfectly. "Tomorrow," he said to Alastair, and the word carried bells and papers and something like weather. He bowed to Elizabeth with precision and left them to their last tasks. At dusk, the house wore the light as if it had been made for it. Elizabeth walked down to the glasshouse one more time, because breath lives there. The quick cutting sat with its leaf angled toward the window, as if listening. The stem at its base had taken on that subtle shift plants make before they surprise you, a ripening of green toward something that would one day be colour. "Not yet," she told it, and smiled. "But soon." She set her palm above it and left a thumb of air, the way she had been taught. On the bench lay the folded sheet with Rory's neat rows and the words he'd written for anything worth keeping. "Cut clean. Set steady. Leave air enough to breathe. In the morning the lawn would fill with voices, and the steps would wear garlands, and a man would speak as if the future were a paper he had already signed. Tonight, under glass, a small, living thing kept to its own time, and a house dressed in borrowed roses learned how to carry its own name. Chapter 16. The Return with Ingenuity. Evie of the Fate, the glasshouse breathed its low summer hum. Elizabeth moved along the benches with a cloth and a pencil stub, checking labels, writing a jar, touching the quick cutting as if to remind it the morning would be kind. Outside, men tested the bandstand legs. Laughter rose, then steadied. In the hall, Mrs. Drummond's army set jars in rows with stamped cards tied neat as prayer flags. A knock sounded at the yard gate. One, then two, like a man who knew the wood and its temper. Elizabeth looked up. Mr. Pritchard, at the far vent, went still and then notched his chin toward the door. Rory came through with a crate in his arms and salt powdering the hem of his coat. He looked as men do who have worked beside the sea, winded, wiry, awake to weather. Behind him, a barrow bumped along, stacked with narrow panes, wrapped in straw and tied with string. "I came to return what's yours," he said to Mr. Pritchard, setting a tool roll on the bench like a small apology, "and to warn you of what isn't." He lifted the lid of the crate. Inside lay small bottles stoppered with cork, a paper twist of fine ash, a bundle of lint-free rags, and a scrap with a neat hand. Gillies' wash, weak, not mean. Ash, water, patience. Mr. Pritchard's brows went up into the weathered thatch of his hair. "You've been busy, lad." Rory nodded once. "Down shore, the hothouse roses took a grey scour, comes on damp air and closed leaves. Men who closed their sashes tight lost half their show in 2 days. Men who opened too much gave the cold a free hand." His glance flicked to Elizabeth and away. "There's a middle. We can make it." Elizabeth stepped nearer, the relief of him in the room like a cup pressed into cold hands. "What do we do? First, space the worst crowded. Lift a leaf here, a pot there. Then wash the leaves with ash water, just a whisper of lye. It dulls the grey, changes the skin so the sickness doesn't like it. Dry with a soft cloth, air a finger's breadth. Heat under, not hard, only steady." He touched the bundle of panes with his palm. "And mend the drafts that make wet where wet shouldn't sit. I fired these at Gillies' shed. They'll cut to our frames if we're clever." Boots on gravel. The door opened to Mr. Boyd and the tidy cold he brought with him. Behind, Baron Blackwood's outline cut the light, a dark stroke where the yard narrowed. Elizabeth felt the house stiffen. "Unscheduled visitors," Mr. Boyd observed, mouth even. His eye landed on Rory, then on the panes. "And contraband glass." "Glass that fits where yours doesn't," Mr. Pritchard said, mild as a whetstone. Blackwood stepped in 3 inches and let his gaze take the room as if it were an entry in a ledger. Benches, vents pegged with copper, a woman with soil at the cuticle, a man who should not be here. He smiled. "We appreciate industry. We prefer notice." Alastair's shadow filled the doorway a heartbeat later, coat on, jaw set, the look of a man pulled from a list and given a room to rule. His eyes found Rory, then his daughter. He did not ask why. He asked what. "Blight moving along the coast," Rory said, crisp. "Grey mould on hothouse roses first, then anything crowded. It comes on when fate rooms get dressed too tight. My method's quick and cheap. Ash wash, spacing, heat steady, no draughts. 3 days and you'll hold what matters." 3 days, Mr. Boyd repeated, making it sound like a trespass. 3, Rory said. "Tonight for wash, tomorrow to dry and mend, morning of the fate to dress what's honest and throw away what lies." Elizabeth felt her father weigh the words and the men and the weather no one could see. She stepped into the space where doubt breathes best and left it less room. "He saved us twice this winter," she said, tone even as paper laid flat. "Let him save the show we mean to make." Mr. Pritchard folded his arms, the bandage at his finger clean and old. "I'll stake my name on the lad's hand. If he's wrong, dock me after." Blackwood's smile gentled, which made it sharper. "You've strong loyalties, Lady Elizabeth. Admirable, but we've guests to reassure and an announcement to set into agreeable air. Disorder on the lawn is not." "Order starts here," Alastair said, not raising his voice. He looked at Rory the way men look at maps when the road underfoot has turned. "You'll have 3 days in my glasshouse. You'll answer to Mr. Pritchard. You'll treat my daughter as if she were made of iron and not of glass." Rory took the terms like orders he'd been hoping to hear. "Aye, Laird." Mr. Boyd's ledger made the sound lids make. "I'll note the indulgence." "Note the result," Aunt Morag said from the threshold, having appeared with the exactness of a bell at the hour. "Ink that." Blackwood inclined his head, accommodating. "By all means. If we get through the day with the illusion of endless summer, I shall call it a triumph of horticulture and discretion." Rory didn't answer him. He was already laying out the bottles, dosing ash into water with a quick, exact pinch, stirring until the grey went cloud and thinned. He handed Elizabeth a cloth. "Gentle," he said. "Think of dusting a child's hair." They began. It felt like housework and prayer. Wipe, lift, breathe, set down. Elizabeth worked the back bench while Mr. Pritchard pegged vents, his mutter old as hinges. Rory fitted a pane into the east sash, ran the hot knife along the putty until it lay like cream, then pressed the points home with the flat of his blade. At the second frame he taught one of the younger men the move, once slow, once quick, then watched him try and nodded when it held. "You brought enough glass for all?" Elizabeth asked, drying a leaf that had dulled. "Enough for what's honest," he said. "The rest will get oiled paper and shade." She smiled, brief and unguarded. "Honest will look well. Honest looks like it meant to be here," he said. Blackwood's roses stood in their mossed crates in the north shade, handsomer than scents, heads too heavy. He watched a moment from the doorway, then turned away with a small, readable disappointment, as if he'd hoped for resistance and found work instead. By afternoon, the room had changed key. Leaves held a clean, dull green. The grey had given up where it could be made to. The new panes cleared the worst of the weeping draughts. Heat sat even as a cat. Rory rolled his shoulders once, checked the quick cutting with his palm, and stepped back a fraction, as if not to touch an old bruise with a name. "Drink," Mrs. Drummond ordered, appearing with mugs that steamed like small engines. She handed one to Rory without fuss, as if he were any man on her list and not the shape of an absence still stamped on a door. "Thank you," he said, and meant more. Eve fell in layers, kitchen lamps, then hall lamps, then the last of the sky turned pewter and slid off the roof. Elizabeth stood with Alastair under the arch they had built, listening to the distant clack of tent poles and the nearer quiet of the glasshouse, remembering how to keep itself. "You've your mother's stubbornness," Alastair said, oddly cheerful, "and her knack for hiring the right man when the wrong ones have already signed forms." Elizabeth laughed, a thin, good sound. "We'll be ready." Rory came to them with ash-smudged fingers and a list in pencil. "I've marked what needs shade, what holds sun, and what we ought to throw on the muck heap, rather than let it lie on our name. 3 days and it will look as if winter never came through." "Tomorrow is one," Alastair said. "We'll count from there." Rory nodded, then looked past the Laird to Elizabeth as if to ask forgiveness, permission, or nothing at all. "We'll be kind to the weak ones," he said softly, meaning plants and people both, and brave for the rest. She met his eyes and did not look away. "We will." He turned to go back in, already thinking of the frame that would sulk at dawn, when Aunt Morag's voice, bright as cut glass, called across the lawn, "Mr. Kincaid." He stopped. "On Saturday," she said. If a man were to stand at the edge of the crowd and say nothing at all, he might still see what his hands helped make. I'd not call that trespass. Rory's mouth moved once, not quite a smile. "Aye," he said. "I've business downshore." "Downshore is very near," she replied, and let him go. Night took the last of the blue from the panes. Under glass, the leaves dried clean. On the bench, beside the block with the stamped rose, Elizabeth set down the words she had been carrying since winter, as if she were laying a cloth over something that needed gentleness. Cut clean, set steady, leave air enough to breathe. The house wore its garlands, the glasshouse held, and a man who had left with his cap straight had come back with tools and a cure and the steadiness of tide. 3 days, the Laird had said. They would begin with 1. Chapter 17. 3 Days of Hope. Morning found the glasshouse humming like a held note. Elizabeth pushed the door with her shoulder and felt the room answer. Heat even, leaves dry, the faint lemon of the geranium rising like a kind thought. Rory was already at the east sash with a strip of putty warming in his palm. Mr. Pritchard pegged a vent and scolded it into virtue. "Day 1, Rory said. "Wash, space, mend." "Then breathe," Elizabeth answered, tying her apron. They moved as if the winter had taught their bodies a single grammar. Ash water in shallow basins, soft rags wrung out to almost dry, one leaf lifted, then another. "Gentle," Rory reminded, his voice the same low steadiness she had used to calm the room in frost. Elizabeth dusted a child's hair, she told her hands, and left each leaf clean, dull green. Not show, not shine, only health. By noon, a small army had collected itself from corners of the house. Nellie brought a pail and a grin. The boot boy fetched straw and a story at the same time. Mrs. Drummond drafted 2 footmen with the crisp authority of a field marshal and put them to spacing pots a thumb's breadth apart. Aunt Morag, veil pinned back, rolled her sleeves to the elbow and tied string like a sailor. Quick, neat, kind. "Name your needs," she told Rory, which was almost an apology from a woman who preferred to prescribe. "We'll make the rest behave." "Shade for the tea roses by noon," he said without looking up. "And someone with small hands for the primulas. Crowns sulk if you fuss them." "Small hands," Aunt Morag repeated, and Nellie, triumphant, wiggled her fingers. Mr. Boyd stood at the threshold with his ledger against his chest and made a long note in a neat hand that said he saw everything and approved nothing aloud. The Laird came after and didn't speak at all. He put his shoulder to the south frame when Rory said, "Lift," and held the weight while the pane slid into its bed like a coin finding its old purse. They ate at the benches, oatcakes, a heel of cheese, mugs that steamed. Rory didn't sit. He drank with one hand and, with the other, touched quick cutting without touching it, his palm hovering an inch above. Elizabeth saw the gesture and felt something tip in her chest. Small and undeniable. "Afternoon," Mr. Pritchard announced. "We mend drafts that make wet where wet shouldn't sit." He pressed the copper points home with the butt of the knife and nodded once, as if the pane had agreed to terms. "Evening, we err and bless our sins." They worked until light went the colour of pewter. Elizabeth's shoulders held the good ache of labour that means something. Her hands smelled of loam and soap. Once, reaching for the same jar, her knuckles grazed Rory's. They both looked down as if a shy bird had landed there. Neither apologised. The moment folded itself small and carried on. Day 2 began with heat already waiting, as if the room had kept faith overnight. The ash wash had dulled the grey to a memory on the worst leaves. Elizabeth thinned seedlings with that new hard kindness she was learning to own, one for strength, one to feed the soil. "You're ruthless now," Rory said mildly, approving. "Plants like decisions." "So do people," she returned, not looking at him in case truth startled. "Some of us," he said, the fired panes from Gillies's shed trimmed true, clean edges winking. Rory taught the youngest boy the trick of letting the knife pull the putty rather than push it. The lad's first corner sat proud, his second lay down like cream. "Good," Rory said, and the boy straightened as if someone had found a hinge and oiled it. Aunt Morag arrived at noon with a basket of cards stamped Winter Rose and a spool of narrow ribbon. "String looks honest," she said, "but a bow tells coin where to go." She tied 3 in quick succession, practical, pretty, no fuss, and pressed the rest on Nellie, who tied them in the same rhythm as laughter. Blackwood walked through at the blue hour and found only work where he might have preferred to find grievance. "Progress," he said, as if the word were a coin he could afford to spend. His eyes landed on Elizabeth's hands, green at the half-moons, and then on the Laird's shoulder where putty had left a pale smear. He smiled perfectly and withdrew, leaving order more precise than comfort. Evening fell into the seams. Elizabeth checked the quick cutting, leaf set like a small ear toward light, and left a whisper of air beneath its bell. She slept with the scent of lemon on her hair and woke to the knowledge before thought that the third day would hold. Day 3 opened clear, wind from the west, a kindness. The glasshouse felt ready when she entered, benches dressed, vents true, heat like a low animal purr. Mr. Pritchard ran a last look down the rows and declared, with extravagant restraint, "It will do." They staged what would be seen and saved what should be hidden. The hothouse teas from Blackwood's crates, handsome, heavy-headed, stood at the north end under shade, faces turned but tamed by local green. Along the hall table, jars wore their stamped cards and the light they'd been given. The arch on the steps held the hedge roses like a promise that hadn't needed London to be spoken. Elizabeth cut a single bud from the back bench, the first on the quick-cutting's sister, and set it in a plain glass at the end where no one would claim it and everyone would see. "Ready," Rory said, quiet. He had washed his hands. Ash had left an honest grey along his knuckles that would not come clean yet. He looked as men do when they've chosen to stand near joy and not own it. Steady, a little apart, all the same in the room. Alastair came to the door and took in the work as if air had grown easier to carry. "I told you 3 days," he said, something like pride thinning his voice. "You gave us 1, Elizabeth answered, and he understood. Outside, tents breathed, fiddles tuned, people began to arrive with their hopeful faces. Inside, the glasshouse kept its own weather. Mr. Pritchard tapped the quick cutting's cloche and said to no one and to all of them, "Courage now." Elizabeth looked at Rory, and he at her, and for a heartbeat, the room held only the sound of heat and the soft thrum of something beginning. Then the door opened to voices and bells, and they stepped into the day they had made. Chapter 18. The Fate and the Farewell. By noon the lawn had a pulse. White tents lifted and settled like sails, the borrowed bandstand tried out a reel and then remembered itself. Jars on the hall table caught the light and gave it back through water and stems. The arch on the steps wore hedge roses and a few of Blackwood's teas tamed into their places. Everywhere the little stamp showed, winter rose, tied to necks with narrow ribbon. Elizabeth moved through it with a list in her pocket and earth still at the half-moons of her nails, no matter what soap said. Mrs. Drummond's army refreshed lemonade. Aunt Morag set cutlery like a general aligns cavalry. Mr. Pritchard stood at the top of the east stairs, as unobtrusive as a saint in a dusty chapel, watching the wind and the shade with a weather eye. Somewhere behind, the glasshouse kept its own breath, vents pegged, leaves dry, heat even. Guests arrived in their summer best. The lawyer's wife with a new hat too eager to speak, the seamstress who'd come first at market day, children who ran in loops until a footman held out a biscuit like a lure. Laird Alastair made the rounds with that grave courtesy people trust. Mr. Boyd moved like a plumb line through a room of string, ledger tucked under his arm, because a man who holds a book feels taller. Baron Blackwood appeared when the air was most pleased with itself. His carriage drew a small, admiring hush. He stepped down in a coat made to suggest he didn't need summer to be warm, and for a moment even the bandstand seemed to lower its voice. "Laird MacRae," he said, and shook hands in a way that made coins sound without showing any. He bowed to Elizabeth. "Lady Elizabeth, a triumph." "Not yet," Aunt Morag said pleasantly. "First we eat." The band struck a tune that thought better of hurrying. Alastair stood on the steps under the arch and spoke thanks that fit like a good jacket, no ornament where none was needed. When he would have stepped down, Elizabeth felt something rise in her like breath and found her own name moving into the air. "May I?" she asked softly, and when he nodded, she turned to the crowd. The sight of faces nearly stopped her, neighbours and names and strangers who might one day tell stories, but the words came from where her hands had been all winter. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You'll think me sentimental if I thank roses first, so I'll not. I'll thank hands." She glanced to the top of the east stairs. "Mr. Pritchard, who keeps our temper as well as our vents. Nellie, who ties a bow better than any parson. Mrs. Drummond, who feeds courage. The boys from McFarlane's, the stable lads who carried warmth in barrows when the wind said no. And," she swallowed once, kept her tone even, "the man who showed us how to be warm for each other when the glass sang, Rory Kincaid." A ripple went through the lawn the way wind goes through barley, soft, then noticeable. Heads turned toward the edges, the polite place where working men stand when they've come only to see that what they set in motion won't go astray. Rory stood near the north shade, cap in hand, coat brushed clean, the sea still in the set of his shoulders. He didn't move. He only bowed that bare inch that says heard. Blackwood's smile did not alter. His gaze held a fraction on Elizabeth's mouth as if choosing which word had made her careless. "We owe the morning to them," Elizabeth finished. "If anything here pleases you, carry that thanks home." Applause came like rain, light, then steadier when Aunt Morag began it with 3 decisive claps. Mr. Pritchard did not clap, he only stood more upright, which mattered more. Blackwood lifted his glass. "To MacRae House," he said, and the lawn quieted. "To its good name and better future, to generosity." His eyes found Elizabeth again with the exactness of a compass. "To decisions that give comfort to many and cost very little to the few who make them." A pause, just long enough to be heard. "To Lady Elizabeth." "Lady Elizabeth." The lawn returned, obedient as a refrain. Somewhere near the bandstand a child cheered as if for a race. Somewhere near the lemonade table someone whispered Easter, like a date and a prayer. Elizabeth lowered her glass before it reached her mouth. The lemonade smelled of sugar and lemons. She could not taste either. Alastair's hand touched her elbow, the brief private weight that says, "Stand as you wish, I will bear the rest." She breathed and did not break the air with anything she could not mend. The afternoon went by in bright pieces. Cards stamped with winter rose tied to jars. A young couple asked whether subscriptions might extend to August. The curate's wife admired the arch as if it had always meant to grow there. Blackwood walked the lawn at Alastair's side and approved of things. Mr. Boyd approved of lists. Elizabeth worked while appearing to drift. She made certain the shade fell where it must. She rescued a jar from a child's elbow with a hand faster than lamps notice. She stood a moment in the doorway and listened for the glasshouse's hum as if fearing silence would have replaced it. He found her in the cool of the side hall, where garlands turned the stones soft. "Gracefully done," Blackwood said, voice for private rooms only. "Names are a kind of coin. You spend them. You buy loyalty." "I thanked work," Elizabeth answered even. "You thanked a man," he returned, as if correcting a sum. "The wrong one, but not at all badly." He set 2 fingers on the ribbon at her sleeve, as if adjusting what needed no adjustment. "After today we settle terms, quickly." She did not draw back. She did not drift nearer. She imagined instead the peg of a copper nail driven into a vent to keep weather true. "After today," she said, "we take down garlands and count jars and rest the men who stood in the sun." He laughed once, perfectly. "You like to be brave where it costs least." A breath. He leaned an inch, enough for her to smell the starch of linen and the faint varnish of a carriage door. "Be careful whom you make visible, Lady Elizabeth. Some names are tinder. Some names are water," she said, and left him the hall as if it were a field he had measured wrongly. On the north shade's edge, Rory had been a shadow and a witness. He had drunk his lemonade slowly and spoken to no one who did not speak first. When the toast settled and the band took a reel, he saw the weight the day had placed on Elizabeth's shoulder and knew what his being here would cost her tomorrow. He set his cap on. He took 1 step into the flow of the lawn and then altered course, slipping along the edge where servants walk when they must not be seen and still must do. He reached the glasshouse door as the tune changed key. Inside, the room waited as if it had kept an hour aside for him. He walked the aisle once, the way men do who have said they are only looking and mean to remember with their hands. He touched nothing. At the back bench he stopped. The quick-cutting sister had lifted a bud until it seemed the bare skin of green might tear with effort. The latch lifted behind him. Elizabeth came in as if crossing a threshold she had dreamt for months. No hurry, because haste makes things small. No drama, because some rooms do not forgive noise. She stood opposite him with the bench between, the old distance that had kept them decent and undone. "The lawn likes you less than it needs you," she said, and nearly smiled. "The lawn will forget me by dusk," he answered, and nearly smiled back. They stood in the soft heat a while, hearing their own words as if someone else had prepared them, and they had only to set them where they belong. At last he said, "I should go." "I know," she said. He looked at her as men do when they mean to carry a thing alone and cannot. "I would have loved you all my life." Her breath left and returned like someone had opened a window and found the air kinder than expected. "You already did." He tipped his head, accepting the verdict as grace. For a moment the winter night was there again, the crack of glass, his arm coming round her without permission or apology, and then it was gone, replaced by this tender, unbearable decentness. "Keep the stamp," he said, "useless and necessary. Use it until it wears thin." "I will," she said. "I'll cut another when it does." He laughed, the quiet kind that costs. "Good." Footsteps hurried past outside. A child called for lemonade. The band rose and fell as if the lawn were a boat and someone had found weather to suit it. Inside, the glasshouse held them the way a hand cups a match in wind. "I won't ask you to stay," Elizabeth said. Asking would be a way to hide. "I know," he said, "and I won't ask you to go." They did not touch. It would have been easier to be foolish. Instead, they let the bench stay between them like a witness. He bowed a fraction, workman to lady, friend to friend, then turned and went the length of the aisle with the steady step of a man who has decided what he can bear and what he must not break. When the door closed, Elizabeth stood where she was and listened to the room. The bud on the sister plant had taken one more breath toward opening, a seam paler at the edge, tight as a held note. On the lawn, Blackwood raised another glass, and the band found the tune everyone knew. In the kitchen, Mrs. Drummond counted plates and declared them sufficient by some arithmetic of her own. Mr. Pritchard folded his arms and looked at the clouds with a face a rooster would think twice about arguing with. Alastair sought his daughter's figure on the steps and did not see it, and trusted she was where breath lives. Under glass, a small living thing prepared to open on its own time. Elizabeth laid her palm above it and left a thumb of air, the way she had been taught. Then she squared her shoulders, drew the door, and went back into the day she had made. Chapter 19. What saves a harvest? The morning after the fete, the lawn wore footprints like lace, and the arch drooped a little, honest in its tiredness. Inside the glasshouse, the air held even. Leaves were dull green and dry. The lemon geranium lifted its clean handkerchief, as if to say, "Carry on." Elizabeth lifted the first frame. Warm air rose and touched her face. Mr. Pritchard tested a vent peg with his thumb and grunted, satisfied. "Held," he said. "That's the word." By 10 the yard had visitors not dressed for lemonade. The grocer from the high street came with a ledger and a look like a man who'd smelled luck. "Your cress kept," he said, almost accusing. "Dunbrays went to grey. I'll take 10 baskets a week, 2 shillings above last." Before Elizabeth could answer, Mrs. Stenhouse appeared on the path, hat askew, cheeks bright with purpose. "Double me," she said without preface. "The ladies declared my table a relief yesterday, and I mean to keep it so. And 3 extra jars for the kitchen girls. Work eats." Behind them the innkeeper shifted his cap. "The coach from Banff brings folk who believe spring sits on plates. Give me green, I don't have to lie over." Mr. Boyd stood with his ledger tucked to his ribs, watching coin pledge itself with very little help from his pencil. He tried once to suggest a smaller number of baskets and a longer list of promises. Elizabeth only smiled and said, "We'll fill what we can keep," and wrote keep with her mother's pencil in her own small ledger. Before noon, a boy from the next parish panted into the yard with a note crushed in his fist. Mr. Pritchard took it, smoothed it on his thigh, and whistled. "Kinloch's house," he said to Elizabeth, low. "Grey on their roses, grey on their peas. Asking any spare frames, any advice, which is a high sentence for that proud lot." "Send the wash," Elizabeth said at once. "And the note," Rory left. "Tell them to err by inches and throw away what lies." "Kind to the weak, brave for the rest," Mr. Pritchard murmured, and went to the cupboard where the bottles waited. By afternoon, orders felt like weather. A letter from the bank manager arrived, courteous as a handshake in church. Encouraged to see renewed liquidity, quarterly terms flexible if present improvement holds. Mr. Boyd read it twice, then glanced at the rose stamped on the corner of Elizabeth's wrapping papers, as if forced to admit that a potato cut by a gardener could move a figure where his careful neatness had not. "They'll pay on delivery," he warned, as if to save the day from happiness. "Promises fade in sun." "We'll deliver," Elizabeth said. They worked into a rhythm that made the hour behave. Mr. Pritchard kept the vents and the young men steady. Nellie tied bows that persuaded Coyne to feel generous. Mrs. Drummond portioned jars into baskets with the fairness of a judge who has seen long winters. Elizabeth moved between them with lists and sleeves rolled, stamping the small rows on paper collars until the ink smudged her thumb again. Word of the blight spread with the particular quickness of trouble. Dunbray's agent came in the late light with his hat in his hand, the way men do when pride has had its fill. "You've a method," he said to Mr. Pritchard, pretending not to see Elizabeth. "Share and we'll pay." "Share and you'll learn," Mr. Pritchard returned, not unkind. He tapped the ash bottle. "Wash gentle, air honest, mend what leaks. Send your lads and the lass with the small hands if you've one. We'll show you here, you'll do there." The agent's gaze flicked to Elizabeth's bandaged thumb, old now, and came back chastened. "Aye," he said, "we'll send." That evening, Alastair stood in the study with the lid off the tin. The weight of coin inside made a sound when he moved it. Soft, certain, the kind of sound that calms a man who has spent too long standing on thin ice. He didn't pour it onto the desk. He only held the tin a moment longer than one needs to hold a tin, and set it down as if it were something living. "Blackwood will come," Aunt Morag said from the hearth, where she was plucking pins from garlands and setting them in a saucer. "He'll expect bells to behave like servants." "He may," Alastair said. He looked at Elizabeth. "We are, closer. Enough that No is a different creature than it was in January." Elizabeth felt something that wasn't relief so much as permission turn in her chest and find its place. "I don't want a roof bought with a leash," she said, plain. "I want work chosen, not a price put on me, because numbers make cowards honest." Alastair's mouth twitched, pride and grief sharing the same breath. "Then we will see whether prudence can be brave." Blackwood arrived just after the lamps were lit, punctual as a tide in a harbour he owned. His coat was perfect, his smile more so. "A success," he said, as if the afternoon's orders had been his doing. "Well done." He took in the quiet industry of the room, the tin standing plain, Aunt Morag dismantling beauty in order to save it for later, Elizabeth with ink her thumb, and unfolded a paper from his inner pocket as if the day had been waiting for it. "Shall we fix the announcement for Sunday?" he asked, courteous even in pressure. "A short reading after the hymn will do. I've prepared a paragraph for the curate. Modest, uplifting. The town expects to be pleased." Alastair said nothing for a count of 5, long enough to teach silence to behave. "We will not announce on Sunday," he said, voice even. "We'll measure this week's work against need. We'll meet the bank on Wednesday. Then we'll answer you." Blackwood's eyes altered, not the colour, only the patience in them, which thinned like varnish under an unkind cloth. "I have been very reasonable," he said. "Reason is time you can measure." His gaze moved to Elizabeth. "Surely you want calm. I admire courage, Lady Elizabeth. I admire it more when it tidies itself into wisdom." "Wisdom is tidy when it can be," Aunt Morag said, bright as needlework. "Today it's hanging its apron on a nail and counting jars." Blackwood's smile returned to its proper shape. "As you wish." He set the paper down without pushing it. "Wednesday, then." When he'd gone, the room exhaled the way people do when they've carried a heavy thing across a threshold. Alastair touched the note Blackwood had left without opening it, the way a man checks a loaf for weight and sets it back, choosing to knead his own bread. "Elizabeth," he said, and there was the question he had asked her in winter, made new by coin and June air. "What do you want me to do?" She did not need to look at the ledger or the garlands in the saucer or the stamp drying on the sideboard. The answer had ripened slowly and then all at once, like a strawberry under netting. "Protect the work," she said. "Protect the name. Don't anchor our house to a man who calls kindness a leash. If we must take help, let it be for the gardens, not for me." Alastair nodded once, a judgment rendered. "Then that is what we will do." He wrote, while the decision was still warm, a brief note to the bank and another, shorter, to Blackwood. Courteous, unbending, the kind of sentences that make some men rage because they cannot find the seam to pry at. Aunt Morag sanded the notes and watched the grit drink the wet and smiled like a woman who has waited for a spring and found it worth the cold. News kept arriving like weather. Kinloch sent word that the ash wash had arrested the grey and enclosed a half-sovereign for advice kindly given. Mr. Gillies downshore sent a scrap in his careful hand. "Your lad knows his heat. Send for more pains when the shed cools." MacVie walked up in the late light with a bowl of soup, for anyone who thinks soup makes a meal, and a glance at Elizabeth that said she knew how good looks and good work keep different clocks. Rory did not come. He had the sense not to. But his method had. It sat in the vents and the spacing and the dull green of leaves that had been wiped with a cloth wrung out to almost dry. It sat in the tin with coin that chimed like small votes. It sat in the little stamp whose corners had begun to round with use. Near midnight, Elizabeth went down to the glasshouse alone. The pipes purred. The cuttings held their quiet green. On the sister shrub, the one that had blushed and thought better of it, colour gathered again at a seam. Not pink, not yet, only the faintest wine at the edge. "Almost," she whispered, palm above, leaving a thumb of air. She turned at the sound of a step and found her father in the doorway, coat thrown over his shoulders like any man who had gone to check a gate and found the path leading farther. "Tomorrow I'll tell him," he said. Not in the hall, not with an audience. In the study, with the ledger shut. He looked at the little bench where work had taught them both their names. If he pushes, he leaves hungry. If he behaves, he leaves fed. Either way, he leaves without your yes. Elizabeth breathed, and the breath felt like a choice she could keep. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he answered. "You turned winter into work and work into coin. That saves more than a roof." They stood a moment in the soft heat, listening to leaves hold their own. Somewhere in the night an owl marked time. In the morning the grocer would come with his book and the innkeeper with his hat and Mrs. Stenhouse with her appetite for green. The world would ask again what could be kept and what must be let go. For now, the house held. The harvest would come because someone had taught it how, and a father had chosen his daughter's word over a gentleman's timetable. Elizabeth set the cloche back over the bud and watched the glass fog, then clear. "We'll be kind," she said into the quiet. "And brave," Alastair answered, and drew the door to behind them. Chapter 20. Winter Rose Epilogue. Wednesday came in honest light. The bank manager drank Mrs. Drummond's strong tea, walked the glasshouse aisle like a man reading a ledger in green, and nodded at each warm breath that rose from the frames. "Your receipts tell one tale," he said to Alastair. "Your work tells the same. We will extend on fair terms, provided the baskets keep." He closed his book with a sound that was not unfriendly. "I prefer roofs held up by hands I can see." When he'd gone, Alastair stood a moment with his palm on the warm brick, as if answering an old fear with heat. Then he sent for Blackwood. They spoke in the study with the ledger shut. Aunt Morag sat at the hearth and stitched. The clock kept its slow faith. "We will not announce on Sunday," Alastair said even. "We will not announce at all." Blackwood's smile kept its shape a heartbeat too long. "You mistake me for a man who likes to be refused." "I mistake you for a man who can bear it," Alastair returned. "The estate will meet its note without tying my daughter to it." A pause, soft, dangerous. Blackwood's gaze moved to Elizabeth, who stood by the window with her mother's pencil in her pocket and earth faint at the half-moons of her nails, no matter what Soap said. "You have made yourself very visible," he said, courteous as a knife in paper. "Visibility burns." "Some lights are worth the fuel," Aunt Morag observed and bit off a thread. Blackwood bowed with the exact degree required. "Then I withdraw my offer and my roses. I wish you joy of your industry." He left with the quiet of a door built well and used to being obeyed. By supper, word travelled the way it always does. The grocer doubled his order because London flowers wilt in northern throats. Mrs. Stenhouse sent a note that read simply, "We prefer how our own grows." The curate's wife burned Blackwood's printed paragraph as kindling and said grace over soup. 2 mornings later, Mr. Boyd requested an interview. He stood as straight as his ledger and did not reach for it. "I am no longer the man for this post," he said to Alastair, each word placed like a coin a clerk has counted twice. "I have served carefully. I see that care can be a kind of cold." "Perhaps," Alastair said. "And perhaps books are best kept by men who can tell a roof from a rule." He accepted the resignation with civility and without triumph. Quiet pressure had been applied in the right places, by townsfolk who now preferred to be seen at the Winter Rose table, by a bank manager who admired work, by a Laird who had remembered his own spine. Mr. Pritchard came to the glasshouse that afternoon in his Sunday coat and set his hand on the bench with ceremony. "I'll keep a finger in the vents and my boot in any lad who forgets to close them, but this place wants a head who's still growing." He looked at Elizabeth first, then behind her. "Fetch him." Rory had not come up the path since the fete. He arrived as men do who are not sure whether a door is meant for them, and only stayed when Alastair opened it wider. "You kept us," the Laird said, plain. "Will you keep us again? Take the head gardener's post, with Mr. Pritchard to swear at you when you deserve it and defend you when you don't." Rory's mouth moved once, a man tasting a word he hadn't let himself keep. "Aye," he said at last. "On the condition the boys who carry heat in barrows earn more than thanks, and the lass with small hands who minds the primulas gets Sundays to herself when the frames allow." Mr. Pritchard barked a laugh. Listen to him bargaining for other people's pockets. Good, sign him before he remembers to be modest. So they signed. Not on paper first, but with work. Rory set his palm above the beds and felt the even breath he had taught them. He touched the copper pegs, approved how they held. He walked past the north sash and did not stop to count what had been taken and returned. He knew the tally already. Toward evening, Elizabeth came down in a dress she'd been too busy to remember and sleeves she would happily push up in a heartbeat. He had been mending the small crack that had sulked all spring. He put the knife aside and wiped his hands as if to keep from carrying anything into the next minutes except what they'd both chosen. "We're mended," he said. "Mostly." "Mostly," she echoed, smiling the kind of smile that knows the rest is patience. They stood at the back bench where the first cuttings had dared the cold. The quick one, stubborn from the start, had thickened to something certain. Beside it, on the mother's shrub, a single bud had finally taken the last step beyond thinking. It opened as they watched. Petals lifted from each other like careful friends, white tinted with a breath of wine at the seam. The scent rose, honeyed tea and something clean, and for a moment the winter glass sang in their ears again, and then the song changed into this: proof that heat and patience are cousins, and that both can be taught. Rory did not reach for Elizabeth's hand. He let the space be what it had been, their lesson and their guard, and spoke as if setting a peg into a vent to keep the weather true. "I'll not ask for what the town thinks I shouldn't," he said. "I'll ask for time, for work, for the right to stand where the plants do, near light, near heat, near you, until you say otherwise." Elizabeth breathed once, and the breath felt like the first day after a fever when soup tastes like soup again. "I don't want otherwise," she said. "Not now. Not later, if later comes the way we make it." He glanced to the door as if to be sure no one had assigned their moment an audience, then back to the bloom, then to her. "We'll be stared at," he said, almost wry. "We already are," she answered. "Let them watch us carry baskets. Then we'll carry them well." Alastair stood in the doorway and didn't enter, a father learning the new ways of blessing. Aunt Morag, passing behind him with a coil of ribbon, did not look in. "Make it behave," she murmured to the air, which was her way of wishing joy. Mrs. Drummond would say later that the tea had been particularly right that evening. Nellie would put the last stamped card in a drawer and keep it there the way people keep a charm. Downshore, Mr. Gillies would add a line to his ledger: glass delivered to MacRae, head gardener named, weather improving. In the soft heat, Elizabeth set her palm above the opened flower and left a thumb of air, the way she had been taught. "We'll be kind," she said. Rory's answer was the answer he had promised the night the roof sang and everything afterward, and brave.
This was The Laird's Winter Rose, written by Baron Blackwood. I hope you enjoyed my short story. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I have written over 500 short stories over the years under many pen names. I will be updating these and recording them under the Baron Blackwood's name. I will be listing them on YouTube as fast as we can get them recorded. They will include historical drama, humor, adventure, romance, period drama, mystery, thriller, war stories, spy stories, revenge, horror, psychological horror, dystopian, disaster, children's stories, love stories, and more. Too many to name. Something for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. It helps others find my channel. Until next time, thank you for listening to the end.